Picture this, a civilization so chaotic, so brilliantly dysfunctional, that it somehow conquered 3 continents while constantly fighting itself. Rome wasn't just messy, it was beautifully, catastrophically messy on every conceivable level. Living there meant navigating streets filled with everything you'd rather not step in, dodging chamber pots emptied from 3rd-story windows, and breathing air thick with smoke from 1,000 workshops. The smell alone could knock you unconscious. Dealing with Roman bureaucracy was like wrestling a hydra made of paperwork. Every simple request required bribes, connections, and enough patience to outlast geological epochs. Romans perfected the art of making simple things impossibly complicated. And trying to understand their history? That's where things get really wild. There's no single version of their story. It's like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle where every piece comes from a different box. Here's the thing about Rome that drives historians absolutely insane. Every social class remembered it differently. Every conquered province had their own perspective. Every generation rewrote the narrative to suit their political needs. Even the Romans themselves couldn't agree on basic facts. But beneath all that chaos lies something extraordinary. The idea of Rome itself. 4 letters carved into stone across 3 continents, SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome. Not just a name, but a sacred promise that somehow survived centuries of revolution, civil war, and complete governmental overhauls. What made Rome special wasn't just what they built, though their architecture still makes modern engineers weep with envy and frustration. It was how they built it, with methodical patience that bordered on obsession, generation after generation working towards something they'd never lived to see completed. Fathers teaching sons to lay stones for walls their grandsons would finish. Politicians passing laws for institutions their great-grandchildren would inherit. The early Romans were playing the ultimate long game, like chess masters thinking 50 moves ahead. They planted seeds knowing their descendants would harvest the fruit centuries later. And that patience, that deliberate cultivation of something greater than themselves, created the most enduring civilization in human history. But here's where it gets interesting, and monumentally frustrating for anyone trying to understand how this all began. If you want to know the real origins of Rome, you'll have to settle for something that's part history, part mythology, and entirely propaganda. In 390 BC, Gallic tribes swept down from the north like a natural disaster with swords. They torched Rome so thoroughly that virtually every early record, every chronicle, every official document went up in smoke. The Romans were left with nothing but half-remembered stories and a burning curiosity about their own origins. So they did what any civilization would do when faced with an identity crisis. They invented one, but not haphazardly, not randomly. They crafted their origin story with the same methodical precision they'd later use to build roads that lasted millennia and aqueducts that still function today. These weren't just campfire tales told to amuse children. These were carefully constructed narratives designed to explain everything about what Rome was, what it stood for, and what it intended to become. Every character served a purpose, every detail mattered. The story they eventually settled on goes something like this, and it's absolutely bonkers. Around 1100 BC, Troy burned in one of history's most famous sieges. From that inferno escaped Prince Aeneas, carrying his elderly father on his back and the future of Rome in his bloodline. Aeneas wandered the Mediterranean like some Bronze Age Odysseus, facing storms, monsters, and angry gods. He finally washed up on Italian shores, exhausted but determined. There he conquered the plain of Latium through a combination of warfare and strategic marriage. But this wasn't Rome yet, just the prologue to Rome. Aeneas established a dynasty that would rule for centuries from the city of Alba Longa, nestled in the hills south of where Rome would eventually rise. His descendants ruled peacefully for 4 centuries, which in ancient Italian terms might as well have been 4 millennia. Then came the betrayal that would set everything in motion and give us one of history's most dramatic origin stories. King Numitor got overthrown by his power-hungry brother Amulius in a coup that would make modern political thrillers seem tame. Amulius didn't just steal the throne, he wanted to end the bloodline forever. So he forced Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin. The plan was brilliantly simple. No children meant no legitimate heirs, which meant no threats to his stolen throne. It was the ancient equivalent of cutting off loose ends. But Amulius forgot about the gods, and in Roman mythology the gods never forget about you. Mars, the god of war himself, had very different plans for Rhea Silvia. Divine intervention has a way of complicating even the best-laid political schemes. She gave birth to twins, Romulus and Remus. When Amulius discovered this inconvenient development, he ordered the babies drowned in the Tiber River. But the river itself seemed to rebel against this infanticide. Instead of drowning, the twins washed ashore where they were discovered by a she-wolf who had just lost her own cubs. In a moment that defies all biological logic but makes perfect mythological sense, she nursed them as her own. Later shepherds found these wolf-raised boys and adopted them, completing what might be history's most complicated family tree. One father, two mothers, a god, a wolf, and a pair of shepherds all played parental roles in raising Rome's future founders. The twins grew to manhood, knowing nothing of their royal heritage, living as simple shepherds in the hills around the Tiber. But destiny has a way of revealing itself, and when they learned the truth about their birth and Amulius's crimes, they gathered supporters and overthrew the usurper. With their grandfather Numitor restored to his rightful throne, the twins decided to found their own city along the Tiber's banks. This seemed like a reasonable plan until they started arguing about where exactly to build it. What began as a simple disagreement about city planning escalated into something far more sinister. The twins couldn't agree on the location, the layout, or even who would rule this new settlement. Their quarrel erupted over the height of the city walls. Romulus killed Remus in a fit of rage, committing what would become the first but definitely not the last case of Roman-on-Roman violence. That fratricide would echo through Roman history like a curse. That's why we call it Rome, not Rheims. The city got its name through bloodshed, which turned out to be remarkably prophetic of everything that would follow. With his brother's blood still warm on the ground and his kingship secured through murder, Romulus set about populating his new city. His recruitment strategy was unconventional, to put it mildly. He welcomed bandits, exiles, runaway slaves, and every variety of outlaw that Italy had to offer. Rome's first citizens were society's rejects, which explains a lot about Roman culture's peculiar relationship with authority and violence. But having a city full of rough men created an obvious problem. No women, no families, no future generations. Romulus solved this with typically Roman directness and brutality. Then came the infamous rape of the Sabine women, a mass kidnapping disguised as a religious festival that ensured Rome would have wives and future generations. Not exactly romantic by modern standards, but effective in the brutal logic of ancient city building. Surprisingly, this crime against an entire people somehow worked out. The Sabine women eventually embraced their Roman husbands, and their children became the first true Roman generation, blending Sabine and Latin bloodlines. Romulus didn't just found a city, he invented Roman civilization wholesale, like some ancient urban planner with unlimited authority. The class system dividing patricians and plebeians, marriage laws, the patron-client relationships that would define Roman society for centuries. Even the Senate supposedly sprang fully formed from his mind, along with the religious rituals, legal procedures, and social customs that would govern Roman life for over 1,000 years. After Romulus came 6 more kings, each adding their own innovations to this growing city-state. The last 3 were Etruscans from the powerful Tarquini clan, bringing new technologies and architectural knowledge from the north. The final king was Tarquinius Superbus, literally Tarquin the Arrogant, and he lived up to his name spectacularly. His tyranny became so unbearable, his crimes so outrageous, that the Romans staged their first successful coup in 509 BC. They threw off the monarchy forever and established the republic that would conquer the known world, swearing sacred oaths that no single man would ever again hold absolute power in Rome. Now, here's the beautiful irony that makes this entire story both fascinating and maddening. This origin myth is almost certainly complete fiction, crafted centuries after the supposed events. The founding date of 753 BC was basically an educated guess made 7 centuries later by Roman scholars trying to align their history with Greek Olympic records. They were reverse engineering their own chronology. The journey of Aeneas reads like obvious fan fiction of Homer's Odyssey, complete with divine interventions, exotic locations, and conveniently timed prophecies. Even ancient readers recognized the similarities. That 4-century gap between Aeneas and Romulus was awkwardly filled in by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, a 1st century BC historian who probably invented the entire dynasty of Alban kings to make the timeline work. The mathematical impossibility becomes clear when you realize that 7 kings supposedly ruled for exactly 244 years. That requires each to have reigned for an average of 35 years, a statistical miracle that would make modern actuaries laugh. Even the famous she-wolf story raises eyebrows. Livy himself, Rome's greatest historian, openly questioned whether Mars actually fathered the twins and whether a real wolf could have nursed human babies. But here's what's absolutely brilliant about Roman mythology. It didn't need to be factually accurate. It just needed to be emotionally and culturally true to what Romans believed about themselves and their destiny. Every single element of their creation myth reveals something essential about Roman identity that would shape their civilization for centuries. They were descended from gods and heroes, giving them divine legitimacy. Their lineage reached back as far as any Greek city, matching the cultural prestige of their eastern rivals. They welcomed outsiders and turned them into citizens, creating a pathway to Roman identity that transcended birth. Civil war was literally encoded in their DNA from day one, explaining their tragic tendency towards self-destruction. They had an inexplicable cultural fascination with wolves that bordered on obsession. And most importantly, they had zero tolerance for tyrants, a political principle that would drive Roman policy for centuries, even when they occasionally became the tyrants themselves. The myth of Romulus welcoming outlaws wasn't meant to be heroic in the traditional sense. It was revolutionary in ways that would reshape the ancient world. In a Mediterranean where citizenship was determined by bloodline and geography, Rome declared that anyone could become Roman if they adopted Roman customs, learned Latin, and embraced Roman values. This wasn't charity or idealism, it was pure strategic genius. Rome built an empire not just through conquest, but through assimilation, turning enemies into allies and subjects into citizens. The Greeks, for all their cultural achievements, thought Romans were barbarians, but Romans were perfectly happy to steal Greek ideas, improve them, and claim credit for the innovations. But alongside this remarkable openness came Rome's original sin, brother murdering brother for political power. That fratricidal founding would echo through Roman history like an unbreakable curse. The Romans who crafted this mythology 7 centuries after their supposed founding understood something profound about the power of narrative. The stories we tell about our beginnings shape everything we become. As we prepare to dive deeper into Rome's actual history, the blood-soaked politics, the impossible military campaigns, the brilliant civic innovations, and the spectacular disasters, remember that these myths matter more than archaeological facts. They reveal the soul of a civilization that thought big enough to dream of ruling the entire world, patient enough to build institutions that lasted millennia, and self-aware enough to recognize both their greatest strengths and their most dangerous weaknesses. The real story of Rome is about to begin, and somehow it's even more incredible than the legends they told about themselves. The Punic Wars and Mediterranean conquest. The real story of Rome was about to begin, and it would be written in blood across the Mediterranean. But first, Rome had to learn how to fight enemies who weren't conveniently located next door. By the 3rd century BC, Rome had successfully conquered most of the Italian peninsula through a combination of military brilliance, diplomatic cunning, and sheer stubborn persistence. They'd perfected the art of defensive expansion, always claiming they were only protecting themselves, while somehow ending up with more territory after each defensive war. But now they faced a problem that would define the next phase of Roman history. What happens when your doctrine of expanding defense meets an enemy who's equally committed to not being defended against? Enter Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, most dangerous enemy, and the civilization that would push Roman military genius to its absolute limits. This wasn't going to be another neighborly Italian squabble settled with a few battles and a peace treaty. Carthage was everything Rome wasn't. Where Rome was land-based and agricultural, Carthage was maritime and commercial. Where Rome conquered through legions and roads, Carthage dominated through trade routes and naval supremacy. Where Rome was ruled by citizen soldiers, Carthage was controlled by merchant princes. They were destined to fight each other, like two apex predators discovering they'd been hunting in the same territory. The only question was when and where the collision would happen. The answer came from the most ridiculous possible source: Sicilian pirates and a bureaucratic misunderstanding that spiraled completely out of control. Some rowdy pirates had been causing trouble between the city of Syracuse and various other Sicilian settlements. Both Rome and Carthage got called in to help sort out this mess, like reluctant parents dealing with squabbling children. Rome and Carthage essentially tripped face first into war over what amounted to a neighborhood dispute. Neither side really wanted this fight, but once the machinery of conflict started grinding, there was no stopping it. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, and for most of that time, Rome and Carthage weren't actually fighting each other directly. They were like two heavyweight boxers spending most of the match trying to figure out how to land a punch. The fundamental problem was tactical. Carthage had been the Mediterranean's dominant naval power for centuries, with fleets that could project force anywhere along the coast. Rome, meanwhile, had exactly zero naval experience and no ships worth mentioning. This created a strategic nightmare for the Romans. How do you fight a naval empire when you don't have a navy? How do you project power across water when your entire military doctrine is based on marching legions down roads? But here's where Rome's most dangerous characteristic revealed itself: their terrifying ability to adapt and learn. Romans were like military sponges, absorbing techniques from every enemy they fought and improving them. When the Romans found a few beached and sunken Carthaginian triremes and quinqueremes washed up on their shores, they didn't just study them. They reverse-engineered an entire fleet from these wrecks. Think about the audacity of this decision. Rome looked at some broken boats and said, "You know what? We're going to build our own navy now. How hard could it be?" They literally learned shipbuilding from scratch, trained sailors who'd never seen the ocean, and created a battle fleet capable of challenging the Mediterranean's greatest naval power. Just casually, as you do. Rome's first aquatic adventures were about as successful as you'd expect from a nation of farmers trying to become admirals overnight. Early Roman naval battles were disasters punctuated by occasional lucky breaks. But Romans had something more valuable than experience. They had institutional memory and the ability to learn from their mistakes. Every defeat taught them something new about naval warfare. At battles like Cape Ecnomus, arguably one of the largest naval engagements in ancient history, Rome proved they could not only compete with Carthaginian seamanship, but actually defeat it. The battle involved over 600 ships and 300,000 men clashing in the waters off Sicily. When the smoke cleared, Rome had won decisively, proving that their crash course in naval warfare had actually worked. Ultimately, Rome won the First Punic War through sheer persistence and their willingness to absorb catastrophic losses while learning from each mistake. They claimed Sicily as their first overseas province and forced crushing reparations on Carthage. But Rome wasn't satisfied with just winning. They also decided to seize Corsica and Sardinia while Carthage was weak, essentially kicking their defeated enemy while they were down. The message was clear: screw you, Carthage. These islands are ours now. In the decades following their humiliating defeat, the Carthaginians were led by the brilliant general Hamilcar Barca, who had a very different plan for dealing with Roman arrogance. Hamilcar colonized the eastern coast of Spain, ostensibly to mine silver for paying Roman reparations. But the real purpose was far more sinister. He was building a new base of power, training new armies, and plotting Rome's complete destruction. For almost 2 decades, Hamilcar, his son Hannibal, and the other Carthaginian commanders in Spain were quietly preparing for the war that would either destroy Rome or end Carthaginian civilization forever. The spark came in 219 BC when Hannibal attacked the Roman-allied city of Saguntum in Spain. Rome, predictably, declared this an act of war and demanded Hannibal's surrender. Hannibal's response was to do something so insanely audacious that it still makes military historians shake their heads in amazement. He decided to march his entire army across the Alps and attack Rome directly. This wasn't just ambitious, it was completely insane. Hannibal gathered over 40,000 soldiers, thousands of horses, and, here's the part that really drives the point home, 37 war elephants. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the sheer madness of marching elephants across the Alps. These weren't mountain-adapted creatures. These were African elephants who had never seen snow, facing mountain passes that challenged even experienced human climbers. But Hannibal wasn't just bringing elephants for practical reasons. He was bringing them for psychological warfare. If you're an ancient Roman who's never seen an elephant before, that creature looks like a four-legged giant with 2 spears and a snake coming out of its face. To Roman eyes, elephants weren't just animals. They were monsters, demons, creatures from nightmares made flesh. The mere sight of them on a battlefield could break the morale of veteran legions. Most of Hannibal's elephants died crossing the Alps, which was probably inevitable given the conditions. But it doesn't take many elephants to have a terrifying amount of elephant on any battlefield. The psychological impact of Hannibal's arrival in Italy cannot be overstated. For generations afterward, Roman mothers would frighten misbehaving children by saying, "Hannibal is at the gates." His name became synonymous with existential terror. After arriving in Italy, Hannibal immediately demonstrated why he's considered one of history's greatest military tacticians by winning 2 crushing victories in northern Italy through guerrilla warfare and brilliant ambush tactics. Then Hannibal did something even more remarkable. He established his army behind enemy lines in the heart of Roman territory, with virtually no supply lines or reinforcements, and stayed there for 16 years. Think about the logistics of this achievement. Hannibal kept an army of tens of thousands fed, equipped, and battle-ready, while surrounded by enemies, living off the land and whatever they could capture or steal. The Carthaginians spent over a decade marching up and down the Italian peninsula, burning farms, capturing towns, and generally making life miserable for Romans, while hoping the Republic would finally surrender. 2 years into this campaign, Hannibal decided he was tired of this slow-burn approach to conquest. He wanted to end the war with one decisive blow that would shatter Roman power forever. His target was the Roman supply depot at Cannae in southern Italy, a battle that would become the gold standard for tactical brilliance and the stuff of military nightmares for Roman commanders. At Cannae, Hannibal arranged his forces in a U-shaped formation with 40,000 infantry forming the front line and 10,000 cavalry protecting the flanks. It looked like a standard battle deployment, but it was actually an elaborate trap. The Romans had almost twice as many soldiers, so they felt confident about their chances. Their plan was simple: smash through the Carthaginian center with overwhelming force and end this war once and for all. The armies met, and as the fighting progressed, the center of the Carthaginian line began falling back under Roman pressure. To the Romans, it looked like their strategy was working perfectly. They were breaking the enemy line. Except this retreat was exactly what Hannibal had planned. As the Romans pushed forward into what they thought was a collapsing enemy formation, they were actually walking into the most perfectly executed military trap in ancient history. At the crucial moment, Carthaginian African infantry and the famous Numidian cavalry advanced from the flanks and completely enveloped the entire Roman army. The hunters had become the hunted in a matter of minutes. What followed was a massacre that still haunts military history. Estimates vary, but the general consensus is that most of Rome's 80,000-strong army was killed outright, with the survivors taken prisoner. It was the single greatest military defeat Rome ever suffered in its entire history. 16 legions, the backbone of Roman military power, were destroyed in a single afternoon. Hannibal believed that this catastrophic loss would finally break Roman will to resist. He expected ambassadors to arrive begging for peace terms, ready to surrender rather than face complete destruction. Rome's response was beautifully, quintessentially Roman. See you next year. They spent the entire winter raising new armies to continue the fight the following summer. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer, balls-to-the-wall Roman stubbornness this response represents. They had just lost at least 50,000 soldiers in a single battle, and their immediate reaction was to tell the guy who killed them to go screw himself and wait for round 2. This takes the kind of massive, suicidal courage that either makes you legendary or gets you completely wiped off the map. Rome was betting their entire civilization on their ability to outlast Hannibal. For the next several years, Roman strategy shifted to something they called just bother him. They shadowed Hannibal around the Italian countryside, avoiding major battles while making his life as difficult as possible. Hannibal was still dangerous and obviously unwelcome, but he wasn't an immediate threat to the city of Rome itself, so this holding pattern was acceptable for the moment. Meanwhile, the war's decisive phase was unfolding in Spain, where a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio had volunteered for what everyone considered a suicide mission. Taking command of the Spanish campaign was widely regarded as career suicide. Previous Roman commanders had been systematically destroyed by Carthaginian forces, and there was no reason to expect this young upstart to fare any better. To everyone's amazement, Scipio spent the next 5 years not only surviving, but systematically de-Carthagifying Spain through a combination of military brilliance and diplomatic cunning. Following his Spanish successes, Scipio hatched a plan so audacious it made Hannibal's Alpine crossing look conservative. He wanted to take the fight directly to Carthage by invading North Africa. The Roman Senate, convinced this was another suicide mission, told Scipio he could attempt his invasion, but they wouldn't provide funding or official support. If he wanted to risk his life on this insane venture, he'd have to do it on his own. So Scipio raised a couple of legions in Italy and Sicily, using his own resources and personal connections, then hopped across the Mediterranean to North Africa. Because apparently, nothing was too crazy for this war. While Hannibal was undoubtedly a brilliant general who accomplished impossible feats like crossing the Alps and campaigning in enemy territory for 16 years, Scipio's genius lay in his quintessentially Roman ability to learn and adapt. Romans had one supreme talent. They knew a good idea when they saw one, and they almost never made the same mistake twice. Scipio had studied the Battle of Cannae obsessively, analyzing every detail of how Hannibal had destroyed a Roman army. Since Numidian cavalry had been critical to Carthaginian success, Scipio cleverly exploited a Numidian civil war to recruit some of their best horsemen for his own army. By turning Carthage's allies against them and recruiting their enemies, Scipio had massively weakened Carthaginian power on their home soil and was on the verge of forcing their surrender. Then came the news that changed everything. Hannibal was coming home. After 16 years in Italy, the great general was finally returning to defend Carthage itself. History enthusiasts across time and space broke out the popcorn, because this was going to be the ultimate showdown between two of antiquity's greatest military minds. The night before the impending Battle of Zama, something extraordinary happened that reads like fiction, but was recorded by multiple ancient historians. Hannibal and Scipio actually met face to face. According to Livy's detailed account, they spent hours in conversation, two great commanders who had been fighting each other across continents finally meeting as equals. First, they expressed genuine admiration for each other's achievements. Then Hannibal, showing unexpected philosophical depth, spoke about the role of fortune in human affairs and even offered Scipio life advice. Finally, Hannibal asked for peace. Scipio's response was both respectful and regretful. "I was actually planning to make peace, but then you showed up here with an army. I can't just leave now." "Look, Hannibal, I respect you more than almost anyone alive, but you're not giving me any choice here. I've got to defeat you. I'm genuinely sorry about this, but there's no other way forward." The next day, some asses were indeed kicked. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio's Numidian cavalry put the Carthaginian horsemen to flight early in the battle. The fighting between the infantry lines was incredibly close and could have gone either way until Roman cavalry returned from pursuing the fleeing Carthaginians and attacked the Carthaginian army from behind. It was a hard-fought, tension-filled battle that decided the fate of two civilizations. With Hannibal's defeat, the Second Punic War was finally over after nearly 2 decades of continent-spanning warfare, but Rome wasn't satisfied with mere victory. Half a century later, after listening to Cato the Elder end every single Senate speech with "Carthage must be destroyed," Rome returned to finish what they'd started. They razed Carthage to the ground so thoroughly that later accounts claimed they salted the earth to ensure nothing would ever grow there again. This is probably mythical. Rome later built their own city on the same site. But the story reveals something important about Roman character. There's regular bitter, there's 90% dark chocolate bitter, and then there's Rome hates you so much they wipe your entire civilization off the face of the earth forever, bitter. The moral of the story is simple. Rome does not mess around, so don't mess with Rome. Salt or no salt, that principle remained absolutely true. With Spain and North Africa now happily Romanized, Roman attention shifted eastward toward the squabbling remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. The Hellenistic kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander's conquests were stagnating, fighting each other over scraps of territory, while their military power gradually declined. The Macedonians had helped Carthage during the Punic Wars, which Rome considered sufficient justification for what they called bespearment, a term they definitely made up for the act of getting stabbed with Roman spears. When the Seleucid Greeks helped the Macedonians, Rome saw that as further provocation requiring additional bespearment. The logic was simple. Anyone who helped Rome's enemies became Rome's enemy. Not wanting to overextend themselves too quickly, Rome stopped at Greece and spent the better part of a century systematically kneecapping every army in the eastern Mediterranean until none of them posed a direct threat. This marked a significant shift in Roman imperial attitude. Italy had been unified through diplomacy, integration, and generous grants of citizenship because Italians were potential Romans. But these new territories were explicitly considered provinces under Roman control, sources of wealth and manpower to fuel further expansion, not future citizens to be integrated into Roman society. Even though Rome was still technically a republic without an emperor, it absolutely possessed an empire by this point. The conquest of Greece and the acquisition of the Kingdom of Pergamum through a royal will made Rome the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But there was one thing that Rome's doctrine of expanding defense could not protect against: Rome itself. By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome had become remarkably efficient at exporting violence to distant lands. In 146 BC, they capped their Punic War trilogy by burning Carthage to the ground and completing their transformation from Italian city-state to Mediterranean superpower. The question now was whether Roman institutions, designed for governing a single city, could handle ruling an empire that spanned 3 continents. The answer would determine whether Rome's greatest enemy would come from outside its borders or from within. Rome's first political assassination blood pooled on the marble floor of the Roman Forum. The year was 133 BC, and for the first time in 4 centuries, Roman citizens had murdered each other over politics. The weapon of choice? Wooden chairs and clubs torn from the assembly benches. Nothing says civilized debate quite like beating your political opponents to death with furniture. Meet Tiberius Gracchus, grandson of the legendary Scipio Africanus, son of a consul, and Rome's first political martyr. His crime? Trying to give land to poor citizens instead of letting wealthy senators hoard it all. The Gracchi brothers weren't some revolutionary outsiders. These were blue-blooded Romans whose family tree read like a who's who of military heroes. Yet they would become the Republic's greatest internal threat. Picture Rome in 146 BC. The same year they reduced Carthage to ash and enslaved every soul in Corinth. Roman armies were painting the Mediterranean red with conquest, adding Greece and North Africa to their growing empire. But while legions celebrated overseas, a darker transformation was brewing at home. The very violence that built Rome's empire was about to turn inward, targeting Romans themselves. Tiberius had a simple idea: enforce an old law from 367 BC limiting public land ownership to half a square mile per person. This forgotten legislation was supposed to prevent exactly what was happening: wealthy elites gobbling up massive estates from conquered territories. The law had been ignored for generations because the people who should enforce it were the same senators who benefited from breaking it. Classic Roman logic: let the foxes guard the henhouse. These weren't small family farms we're talking about. Senators owned sprawling latifundia, worked by slave labor, stretching across territories that once belonged to defeated enemies. Every acre represented wealth beyond imagination. As tribune in 133 BC, Tiberius possessed the nuclear option of Roman politics, the veto power. This office had been created centuries earlier as the voice of common citizens against patrician oppression. His own father had wielded this same power to save Scipio Africanus from a politically motivated bribery trial in the 180s. Supposedly, this act of loyalty earned the Gracchi family their marriage connection to Rome's greatest general. The system worked through weaponized gridlock. Tribunes could veto Senate actions, forcing compromise and negotiation. It was messy, but it prevented tyranny. But when Tiberius pushed his land reforms through the plebeian assembly, the senators deployed their countermove. They found another tribune, one with aristocratic sympathies, to veto the entire proposal. This was legal, but had never been done before. Using a tribune to block popular legislation crossed an unwritten line in Roman politics. The constitution was starting to bend under pressure. Tiberius faced a choice: accept defeat or escalate. He chose escalation. In an unprecedented move, he convinced the assembly to depose the opposing tribune, stripping him of office and nullifying his veto. Constitutional crisis achieved. Then Tiberius passed his reforms anyway, appointing himself and his family members to the commission that would redistribute seized land to landless citizens. Even Romans who supported land reforms started getting nervous. Sure, the cause was just, but the methods were dangerous. Deposing a tribune and creating obvious conflicts of interest made Tiberius look like a power-hungry demagogue. Rome's proto-socialist hero had become problematic. The political machinations revealed how Romans were learning to break constitutional customs before they broke the Republic entirely. Terrified of prosecution once his term ended, Tiberius made his fatal mistake. He announced his candidacy for a second consecutive term as tribune, something that simply wasn't done. His enemies interpreted this as the final proof of tyrannical ambitions. First, he'd broken constitutional norms. Now he was trying to hold power indefinitely. The pattern was clear. The land reforms remained wildly popular with ordinary citizens. Tiberius would probably win re-election easily. The senators couldn't stomach another year of watching their wealth get redistributed to the masses. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The Pontifex Maximus and several senators marched to the assembly with one goal: stop the vote counting by creating enough chaos to derail the election. What started as political theater turned into Rome's first internal bloodbath. The scuffle escalated beyond anyone's control, and with no weapons readily available, the senators grabbed whatever they could find. Chairs became clubs, bench pieces became bludgeons. The marble floors of the Forum, witness to centuries of civilized debate, were about to be baptized in Roman blood. They beat Tiberius Gracchus to death in the heart of the Roman Forum, using broken furniture as their weapons of choice. The symbolism was perfect. They literally destroyed the tools of democracy to kill democracy's champion. But the senators weren't finished. Already covered in blood and drunk on violence, they turned their makeshift weapons on Tiberius's supporters. 300 Romans died that day in the Forum. The massacre introduced two toxic concepts to Roman politics: political martyrdom and the efficiency of assassination. Blood had been spilled, and there was no going back. The senators had crossed the blood-red line that separated civilized politics from savage butchery. They discovered that murder worked, and they liked how it felt. But here's the thing about brothers: they tend to hold grudges, especially when you beat their sibling to death with furniture in front of the entire city. Tiberius had a brother named Gaius, and unlike his murdered sibling, Gaius Gracchus was about to prove that he'd learned from Tiberius's mistakes. The question was, had he learned the right lessons? Julius Caesar, the man who killed democracy. Picture this: a young Roman aristocrat gets captured by pirates, and instead of begging for his life, he insults them for not asking for enough ransom money. That's Julius Caesar for you, the man who would reshape history with his audacity. The Roman Republic was bleeding to death. Civil wars erupted every decade like clockwork between 135 and 30 BC. The system that had conquered the Mediterranean was now eating itself alive. Politicians cared more about personal glory than public good. The Republic desperately needed saving, or maybe it needed someone bold enough to put it out of its misery. Enter Julius Caesar, descendant of Venus herself according to his family tree. But here's the kicker. His father never became consul, leaving Caesar with a massive chip on his shoulder. In Roman society, you couldn't just coast on your family name. You had to prove your worth, and Caesar was determined to do exactly that. Those Cilician pirates learned this the hard way. When they demanded 20 talents of silver, roughly $20 million today, Caesar burst out laughing. 20 talents for me? Make it 50. The pirates, charmed by his sheer arrogance, kept him around for entertainment. Caesar wrote them poetry, told stories, and casually mentioned he'd crucify them all once he got free. They thought it was hilarious, until Caesar returned with a fleet and did exactly what he promised. This wasn't just swagger, this was strategic image building. Caesar understood that reputation was everything in Roman politics. He needed allies, and he found the perfect partners in crime. Crassus, Rome's richest man, and Pompey, its greatest general. Together they formed the first triumvirate, an unofficial alliance that would bend Rome to their will. The plan was elegant in its corruption. Crassus would bankroll Caesar's consulship in 59 BC. Caesar would pass whatever laws Pompey and Crassus wanted. Pompey would marry Caesar's daughter to seal the deal. Everyone wins, except the Republic itself. Caesar's year as consul was a masterclass in breaking democracy. He overrode his co-consul's vetoes, filled Rome with soldiers to intimidate opponents, and rammed through debt forgiveness and land redistribution laws. Completely illegal? Absolutely. But Caesar had Imperium, the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card that made him untouchable while in office. The problem? Once his consulship ended, Caesar would face prosecution for everything he'd done. His solution was brilliant and ruthless: secure a governorship in Gaul with 4 legions and keep that precious Imperium for 10 more years. Some senators tried to sabotage him by offering him governance of Italian forests instead of profitable Gaul. Caesar's allies crushed that attempt with cold, hard cash and political muscle. This is where the Republic's fragility became crystal clear. Anyone with enough money and connections could hijack the entire government. Democracy had become a game for the highest bidder. Caesar took his legions to Gaul and turned warfare into performance art. He didn't just conquer, he documented everything in detailed commentaries, creating the world's first military blog. Every victory justified another year of campaigning. Every triumph built his legend back in Rome. The Helvetii tribe wanted to migrate. Caesar attacked them for threatening Roman allies. The Veneti in distant Brittany. He claimed they'd revolted from Rome even though they'd never been Roman in the first place. Caesar essentially declared all of Gaul to be Roman property and set about collecting it. He bridged the Rhine to scare the Germans. He invaded Britain twice just to prove Rome could reach anywhere. When he lost an entire legion in an ambush, he bounced back with even more aggression. Caesar turned setbacks into motivation and obstacles into opportunities. The climax came at Alesia, where the Gallic king Vercingetorix made his final stand. Caesar faced an impossible situation, besieging a hilltop fortress while enemy reinforcements approached from behind. His solution? Build 2 walls, 10 miles of fortifications facing inward to starve out the city, 14 miles facing outward to repel attackers. 24 miles of wall construction because Caesar refused to accept defeat. When the Gallic relief army arrived, Caesar pulled off one of history's greatest deceptions. He sent out a small cavalry force that the Gauls mistook for massive Roman reinforcements. They panicked and fled, leaving Vercingetorix trapped. In one stroke, Caesar had conquered all of Gaul, but success bred paranoia. Crassus died fighting in Parthia, breaking the triumvirate. Pompey, feeling threatened by Caesar's growing power, convinced the Senate to strip Caesar of his command. Come home defenseless and face trial, they demanded. Caesar's response would echo through history. The die is cast. He crossed the Rubicon with the 13th Legion, transforming from ambitious politician into revolutionary warlord. Pompey and most senators fled to Greece rather than face Caesar's veterans. Rome proclaimed Caesar temporary dictator to restore peace. Ironic, since he'd started the civil war. At Pharsalus in Greece, Caesar's battle-hardened legions shattered Pompey's larger but inexperienced army. The great Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with young Ptolemy XIII. Instead of sanctuary, Pompey found betrayal. Ptolemy's advisors murdered him, presenting his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar was horrified, not just by the brutality, but by the waste. He'd planned to pardon his old friend and ally, not execute him. This reaction reveals Caesar's complex character. Yes, he'd crucified those pirates years earlier, but clemency had become his trademark. He pardoned Pompey's entire army and welcomed former enemies into his ranks. This wasn't just politics, it was revolutionary mercy in an age of brutal retribution. In Egypt, Caesar found both alliance and romance with Cleopatra. Together, they secured Egypt's grain supply for Rome's hungry masses while keeping the wealthy kingdom independent. Cleopatra was brilliant, charismatic, and strategically invaluable, the perfect partner for Caesar's ambitions. Back in Rome, Caesar's dictatorship unleashed a flood of reforms. He restructured provincial governance to prevent future Caesars from hijacking the system. He fixed Rome's chaotic calendar so effectively that we still use his version today. He conducted censuses, built monuments, and unified the sprawling empire under efficient administration. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In 44 BC, the Senate named Caesar dictator for life, essentially making him king in all but name. For Romans who'd expelled their last king 5 centuries earlier, this was unforgivable. Brutus, Cassius, and 60 other senators surrounded Caesar in Pompey's theater on the Ides of March. When Caesar saw Brutus among his assassins, this young man he'd pardoned and mentored, he reportedly covered his face with his toga and accepted his fate. 23 stab wounds ended the life of Rome's most controversial leader. The assassins called themselves liberators, but they'd misjudged everything. The Roman people loved Caesar for his generosity and effectiveness. His murder sparked outrage, not celebration. Brutus and Cassius fled to Greece, their liberation looking more like ungrateful treachery. Here's the brutal truth. Caesar didn't kill the Republic on the Ides of March. He'd murdered it years earlier through bribery, intimidation, illegal legislation, and civil war. By the time he became dictator, he'd already proven that Rome's cherished institutions were hopelessly broken. The Republic couldn't survive in a Mediterranean-spanning empire where ambitious individuals could game the system with enough money and military muscle. Rome faced a stark choice: endless civil wars that would tear the empire apart, or fundamental change that could restore stability. Caesar chose change, even if it meant destroying the government he'd sworn to serve. He showed that strong central authority could work where republican chaos had failed. The paradox is staggering. Caesar saved Rome by killing the Republic. He demonstrated both the system's fatal weaknesses and the potential of unified leadership. His reforms would guide the empire for centuries, even as his methods horrified traditionalists. Caesar's legacy isn't just conquest and clemency, ambition and assassination. He represents the eternal tension between effective leadership and legitimate authority, between necessary change and cherished tradition. His death ended the Republic, but it also planted the seeds of empire. The stage was set for Augustus, Caesar's heir, to build something new from the Republic's ashes. But that's another story entirely, one where the lessons of Caesar's rise and fall would shape the greatest empire the world had ever seen: the rise of Augustus. From assassins to empire blood, pooled on the marble floor of the Senate House as Julius Caesar's lifeless body lay sprawled beneath Pompey's statue. 23 wounds from senatorial daggers had ended the most powerful life in Rome. But the conspirators who thought they'd just liberated the Republic were about to learn a terrifying truth. They'd unleashed forces that would make Caesar's dictatorship look like child's play. Picture yourself as one of those senators, dagger still dripping with dictatorial blood. Your hands shake as reality hits. You've just murdered the most beloved figure in Rome. The assassins expected triumphant crowds welcoming the return of Republican virtue. Instead, they found a city boiling with rage, ready to tear them limb from limb for killing their champion. The people didn't see liberators. They saw traitors who'd butchered their hero. Brutus, Cassius, and their fellow conspirators realized their fatal miscalculation. Like Pompey before them, they grabbed whatever they could carry and fled eastward to Greece, desperately hoping to raise armies before Rome's vengeance caught up with their necks. Back in the capital, Caesar's corpse still lay cooling on the Senate floor while politicians scrambled over the wreckage of government. Most surviving senators despised their dead dictator, but the streets outside thundered with angry crowds demanding justice. A massive power vacuum had opened, and ambitious men circled like vultures. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's most trusted ally and current consul, moved first. This experienced warrior and skilled politician positioned himself as the fallen dictator's rightful avenger, rallying the grieving masses while working behind closed doors. Through careful negotiation, he brokered a compromise. The assassins would receive amnesty, but only if Caesar's popular reforms remained intact. Yet Antony faced the same problem that had plagued Caesar himself. While the common people adored him, the Senate, and especially the sharp-tongued Cicero, viewed him with deep suspicion. After his consulship ended, political pressure forced Antony to abandon Rome for the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, leaving the capital divided between various factions of chaos. While Rome burned with political intrigue, a seemingly insignificant young man absorbed the shocking news hundreds of miles away in Epirus. 18-year-old Gaius Octavianus had been quietly studying astronomy when messengers arrived with word of the assassination. This bookish teenager abandoned his scholarly pursuits and began a desperate race toward Rome that would change the course of human history. Most observers dismissed Octavian as irrelevant. Caesar's great-nephew was just another minor relative seeking to profit from tragedy. They had no idea they were watching the future master of the world making his first moves on the political board. Upon reaching Italian soil, Octavian opened Caesar's will and discovered an inheritance beyond imagination. Not gold, not land, not legions, but something infinitely more precious in Roman society. Caesar had officially adopted him, granting the legal right to bear the most powerful name in the ancient world, Gaius Julius Caesar. This wasn't merely symbolic. In Roman culture, adoption carried the full weight of blood kinship, and names held mystical power. Overnight, a provincial teenager had become the son of Rome's greatest hero. Every citizen who looked upon him now saw Caesar himself, reborn and walking among them once again. Two titans now claimed the mantle of Caesar's avenger. Mark Antony, the seasoned warrior politician with decades of experience, faced off against a teenager who'd never commanded troops, held office, or even witnessed a battle. Yet Octavian possessed something his older rival completely lacked: a genius-level understanding of Roman psychology and the devastating power of cultural symbols. While Antony relied on traditional political maneuvering, Octavian orchestrated something unprecedented in Roman history. Through carefully crafted propaganda and religious manipulation, he convinced an entire civilization that Julius Caesar had literally ascended to become a god. Rome now had the living son of a deity walking their streets, and that changed absolutely everything about the political landscape. The competition for Caesar's legacy became a masterclass in manipulation. Octavian secretly encouraged Cicero to deliver those famous, scathing speeches against Antony, the Philippics that portrayed Mark Antony as a drunken barbarian threatening republican values. Meanwhile, he publicly positioned himself as a humble servant of senatorial authority. When Antony fled north to claim his governorship, he had to wrestle control from one of Caesar's own assassins who currently held the position. The anti-Caesar Senate naturally sided with the current governor against Antony, officially declaring Caesar's former lieutenant an enemy of the Roman state. Here's where the politics became brilliantly twisted. The Senate wanted to send legions against Antony, but they faced one massive problem. They didn't actually control any armies. Octavian, however, had made shrewd promises to Caesar's veterans, convincing them he could pay their promised bonuses if they remained loyal to their dead commander's adopted son. In a move that defied all political logic, young Octavian allied himself with the anti-Caesar Senate to march against the pro-Caesar Mark Antony. On paper, this made absolutely no sense given his entire identity as Caesar's avenger. In practice, however, Octavian proved ruthlessly pragmatic. If helping Caesar's enemies destroy Caesar's friend served his ultimate goals, he'd make that devil's bargain without hesitation. The combined forces of Octavian and the two consuls marched north to Mutina, where they engaged Antony's legions in battle. Octavian's unlikely alliance claimed victory, but both consuls died fighting, leaving the young Caesar as the sole commander of a powerful army. When the Senate smugly demanded that Octavian now dismiss his troops like a good little ally, his response shattered their delusions forever. He laughed in their faces, then marched 8 battle-hardened legions straight to Rome's gates. His message was simple and terrifying: make me consul immediately, or face the consequences. The Senate, suddenly remembering what happened to the last group of politicians who opposed Caesar, quickly complied with his polite request. Mark Antony, meanwhile, had joined forces with Marcus Lepidus in Spain, creating a powerful Western alliance that controlled significant military resources. But Octavian had bigger plans than petty rivalries. He approached his former enemies with a proposal that would reshape the ancient world: the Second Triumvirate. Unlike Caesar's informal alliance with Pompey and Crassus, this new partnership would be legally recognized, granting each member absolute dictatorial power over their domains. The Triumvirate for the reconstitution of the Republic, an ironic name for 3 men about to destroy what remained of republican government, officially divided the Roman world. Octavian claimed Italy, Spain, Gaul, and Illyria. Antony took Greece, Asia Minor, and the wealthy eastern provinces. Poor Marcus Lepidus received Africa, and the scraps, already marked as the junior partner nobody really respected. Yet before they could deal with Brutus and Cassius building armies in the east, the triumvirs faced a critical problem: money. Financing multiple legions for foreign campaigns required enormous resources, and the Senate would never voluntarily fund what they saw as illegal tyranny. The triumvirs solved this dilemma with breathtaking brutality. They compiled death lists containing over 300 wealthy senators and 2,000 prominent landowners, anyone with money who opposed their regime. These weren't executions or imprisonments. These were systematic murders designed to confiscate victims' entire fortunes while eliminating political opposition. The proscriptions began with that initial target list, but rapidly expanded as greed and paranoia took hold. They eventually butchered over a third of the entire Senate, turning Rome's streets into rivers of blood. Among the victims was Cicero himself, whose severed head and hands were nailed to the speaker's platform in the Forum as a warning to anyone who dared oppose the new order. This wasn't civil war. This was domestic genocide. The triumvirs had crossed a line that even hardened Romans found shocking, transforming themselves from politicians into mass murderers. Yet their brutal efficiency worked. They accumulated vast wealth while eliminating virtually all organized resistance. With their ill-gotten treasury filled, Antony and Octavian led their armies eastward to face Caesar's assassins at Philippi in Macedonia. The battle that followed revealed the true dynamic between the two partners. Antony's forces crushed Cassius, who committed suicide rather than face capture. Meanwhile, Brutus overran Octavian's camp. But mysteriously, Octavian himself was nowhere to be found during the fighting. Suspicious doesn't begin to describe Octavian's convenient absence from the most crucial battle of his career. Whether through cowardice, illness, or calculated self-preservation, Caesar's heir managed to avoid personal combat, while Antony did the dangerous work of actually defeating the enemy. When Antony returned to finish off Brutus, who also chose suicide over surrender, the victory belonged entirely to the older partner. This humiliation would haunt Octavian for decades. Roman culture prized military valor above all other virtues, and his perceived cowardice at Philippi became the greatest stain on his reputation. He spent years afterward commissioning artwork and monuments depicting himself as a warrior, desperately trying to rewrite history and restore his damaged honor. With the assassins eliminated and the eastern provinces reconquered, the triumvirs carved up their expanded empire. On paper, this arrangement promised peace and stability after a century of civil wars. In reality, 3 ambitious autocrats controlling different portions of the Roman world represented a powder keg waiting to explode. The golden rule of late Republican politics was simple. Anyone named Pompey would inevitably cause massive problems for anyone named Caesar. Sextus Pompey, son of Caesar's old rival, had spent years building a powerful naval force that controlled the Mediterranean shipping lanes. His blockades regularly starved Rome of grain imports, creating food shortages that threatened urban stability. Octavian desperately wanted to crush this maritime menace, but faced an impossible strategic problem. Pompey commanded the only real navy in the Western Mediterranean, while the triumvirs had focused their resources on land armies. Even their stunning victory at Philippi meant nothing against an enemy who could strike from the sea and disappear before retaliation arrived. Enter Marcus Agrippa, Octavian's childhood friend and the most brilliant military mind of his generation. This tactical genius faced the challenge of building a navy from scratch, while Pompey's ships patrolled the coastline, ready to destroy any training fleet that dared venture into open waters. Agrippa's solution was audacious beyond belief. He ordered the excavation of an enormous artificial lake in the Italian countryside, creating a secret naval base where his crews could learn seamanship without fear of enemy attack. While Pompey controlled the Mediterranean, Agrippa trained his sailors in complete safety, preparing for the moment when his hidden fleet would emerge to challenge the master of the seas. When that moment came, Agrippa's carefully prepared navy demolished Pompey's forces in a series of decisive engagements. The son of Caesar's greatest enemy followed his father into defeat, ending the Pompeian threat forever and securing Octavian's control over Rome's food supply. With Pompey eliminated, Marcus Lepidus made his fatal mistake. The junior triumvir attempted to seize Sicily for himself, perhaps hoping to finally claim the respect his partners had always denied him. Octavian's response was swift and merciless. He stripped Lepidus of all political power and confined him to religious duties, effectively ending the triumvirate and leaving only two masters of the Roman world. Then there were two. Octavian controlled the west, while Antony dominated the wealthy eastern provinces. Their alliance had been sealed by marriage. Antony wed Octavian's sister Octavia after his first wife's rebellion and death. But in 32 BC, Antony shattered that bond by divorcing Octavia and officially marrying Cleopatra VII of Egypt. This wasn't merely a personal scandal, it was a political earthquake. Antony's marriage to a foreign queen suggested he'd abandoned Roman identity for Eastern decadence. When Octavian obtained Antony's will through questionable means, the document revealed even more damning evidence of his rival's transformation. The will declared Antony's intention to be buried in Egypt alongside Cleopatra, treating Alexandria rather than Rome as his true home. Even worse, he planned to bequeath entire Roman provinces to his children with the Egyptian queen, subordinating Roman interests to foreign dynasty building. Octavian pounced on this intelligence like a predator sensing weakness. His propaganda machine painted Antony as a man bewitched by exotic foreign magic, corrupted by Cleopatra's supernatural charms, and forgetting his duty to Rome. The narrative was brilliantly constructed. By focusing on Cleopatra as the primary villain, Octavian avoided the uncomfortable reality that he was preparing to wage civil war against a fellow Roman. Meanwhile, Octavian positioned himself as the embodiment of traditional Roman values. His family supposedly traced back to Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman people. He began construction of an enormous mausoleum on the Tiber's banks, dramatically contrasting his commitment to Rome with Antony's preference for Egyptian burial. The propaganda war escalated when Antony's supporters in the consulship delivered devastating speeches attacking Octavian's character and legitimacy. The next day, Octavian appeared in the Senate House surrounded by armed guards, a gross violation of Republican tradition that sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Several senators fled east to join Antony, but many discovered that the eastern provinces weren't the paradise they'd imagined. Some defected back to Octavian, while others remained caught between competing loyalties. The Republic was tearing itself apart, as citizens chose sides in what everyone knew would be the final civil war. By 31 BC, the Mediterranean world braced for an epic showdown between two radically different visions of Rome's future. Antony represented Eastern monarchy, divine kingship, and the integration of foreign cultures into Roman identity. Octavian championed Western republicanism, traditional values, and Roman supremacy over conquered peoples. The decisive moment came at Actium, a bay on the western coast of Greece where Antony and Cleopatra had established their base. Agrippa once again proved his strategic brilliance by cutting off Antony's supply lines and forcing a naval battle on unfavorable terms. But Actium turned out to be history's greatest anticlimax. After all the build-up, propaganda, and preparation, the battle itself was remarkably unspectacular. Cleopatra and Antony realized they faced either certain defeat followed by capture and execution, or immediate retreat that at least preserved their lives. They chose survival over glory, breaking through Octavian's blockade and fleeing to Egypt with the remnants of their fleet. The decision was tactically sound, but politically catastrophic. Abandoning their supporters in the heat of battle destroyed any remaining credibility their cause possessed. Octavian returned to Rome as undisputed master of the Roman world, while Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria to prepare for the inevitable final siege. The following year, Octavian's legions appeared outside Egypt's capital, and the last act of the Republican civil wars began. Antony committed suicide rather than face capture and humiliation in Octavian's triumph. Cleopatra initially negotiated with the victor, but when she realized he intended to parade her through Rome as a trophy, she chose the same path as her lover. The Queen of Egypt died by her own hand, denying Octavian his greatest prize and ending the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt since Alexander's conquest. With his final rivals eliminated, Octavian annexed Egypt as his personal province, adding its immense wealth to his already overwhelming resources. The totally not a civil war was over, and Rome finally had peace after a century of almost continuous warfare. The exhausted Roman people celebrated their deliverance from chaos, caring little that their savior had destroyed the Republic in the process of saving it. Most citizens were simply grateful that the killing had stopped, while the drastically reduced Senate contained mostly Octavian's own appointees. To mark his transformation from warlord to statesman, Octavian adopted the name Augustus, meaning the exalted one or the majestic. He briefly considered Romulus, but wisely chose a title that suggested divine favor rather than royal ambition. Augustus had achieved the impossible. He'd restored order to a shattered world while maintaining the fiction that he was merely the Republic's first citizen. The reality was far different. Rome now had an emperor in all but name, and that emperor had proven he would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. The Roman Republic was dead, killed not by foreign enemies, but by its own internal contradictions and the ambitions of men who preferred dominion over liberty. In its place stood an empire that would endure for centuries, built on the bones of senators and the dreams of a teenager who'd outmaneuvered every rival in his path to absolute power. Augustus, the master of Rome. Picture this: a 35-year-old becomes the most powerful man in the known world without ever officially calling himself king. Meet Octavian Caesar, soon to be Augustus, the nephew who turned his uncle's assassination into the foundation of an empire that would last over 1,000 years. The young man Cicero once called impressive had just pulled off the political heist of the millennium. After forming an uneasy alliance with Mark Antony to hunt down Julius Caesar's killers, Octavian spent the next decade playing a deadly game of chess across the Mediterranean. His masterstroke? Convincing Romans that Antony had become Cleopatra's lovesick puppet, while positioning himself as Rome's true savior. When the dust settled after their final confrontation, Egypt belonged to Rome, and Octavian held absolute power. But here's where genius meets cunning. Instead of repeating his uncle's fatal mistake of flaunting dictatorial authority, Augustus played a different game entirely. He returns to Rome and performs the ultimate political theater. "I'm giving power back to you, the people," he declares, dramatically resigning his emergency powers. The crowd cheers. The Senate applauds. Meanwhile, he quietly keeps control of Egypt's wealth, Spain's silver, Gaul's resources, and most importantly, the loyalty of Rome's legions scattered across these territories. Augustus never technically broke the Republic's rules. He simply collected enough key positions that he controlled every lever of power simultaneously. Consul here, governor there, ceremonial leader of the Senate, each role perfectly legal, their combination absolutely devastating to any opposition. Unlike Julius Caesar's "I'm dictator for life" approach that earned him 23 stab wounds, Augustus mastered the art of appearing humble while wielding supreme authority. Romans had endured a century of civil wars, They craved peace more than political purity. The closest anyone came to challenging him was a governor in Egypt, who made the mistake of building a monument to his own military success. Augustus sent him a sternly worded letter along with a dagger. The message was clear: there's room for only one celebrated general in this empire. The governor took the hint permanently. While securing Rome's borders and negotiating peace with longtime enemies like Parthia, Augustus launched an unprecedented cultural campaign. He commissioned Rome's greatest poets to craft literary masterpieces celebrating Roman glory. Virgil's Aeneid became the crown jewel, an epic linking Rome's destiny to divine will, while subtly praising Augustus as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. But Augustus's true masterpiece wasn't literary, it was architectural. When he claimed to have found Rome brick and left it marble, he wasn't just talking about buildings, he was describing a complete transformation of Roman identity itself. Before Augustus, Rome was embarrassingly plain compared to Alexandria's marvels or Athens' grandeur. The Eternal City lacked the monuments that would later define it. No Colosseum, no Pantheon, just wooden bleachers around a racetrack and one decent theater built by Pompey. Augustus saw Rome as a blank canvas for the ultimate propaganda campaign. He constructed libraries to house Greek and Roman knowledge, built his family mausoleum to show his commitment to the city, and strategically placed monuments throughout the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, where armies traditionally gathered outside the city walls. Every building served dual purposes: practical function and political messaging. His new forum didn't just provide space for public business. It featured statue galleries tracing both Republican heroes and his own divine ancestry back to Aeneas, with Augustus himself as the glorious culmination of Roman destiny. The centerpiece of this marble revolution was the Ara Pacis, the altar of Augustan peace. This wasn't just another temple, but an open-air sacrificial altar where Romans could witness their emperor's piety firsthand. Every surface told Augustus's story through intricate carvings. Inside, traditional ox skulls and fruit garlands. Outside, over 50 species of plants and animals, rendered in exquisite detail, all originally painted in brilliant colors to represent the Golden Age Augustus had delivered. Mythological panels showed Rome's divine origins, while processional friezes depicted Augustus' own family, alongside senators in religious ceremony. The symbolism was overwhelming yet elegant. Mars, the war god, had fathered Rome's founders, while Venus had birthed Augustus's ancestor Aeneas. The pairing of their bloodlines made Augustus inseparable from Rome's very essence. Even a bored child, tugging at an adult's toga in the carved procession, humanized the imperial family while reinforcing their central role in Roman life. This marble city became Augustus's greatest weapon. Romans saw tangible proof of their emperor's promises: prosperity, peace, and divine favor, literally carved in stone. The architecture worked so well that later dictators would steal its playbook, though none matched Augustus's subtle brilliance. Not everyone appreciated the emperor's moral authority. When Augustus tried imposing strict marriage laws, the poet Ovid responded by writing the ancient world's ultimate guide to seduction, cheekily suggesting Romans use Augustus's own monuments as pickup locations. The emperor was not amused. Ovid spent his remaining years in exile by the Black Sea, possibly along with Augustus's own scandalous daughter. Death finally claimed Augustus in 14 AD at age 75, but not before claiming most of his chosen heirs first. His nephew Marcellus, stepson Drusus, and grandsons Gaius and Lucius all died young, leaving succession to his stepson Tiberius, a choice that would prove problematic for the empire's future. Augustus left behind more than monuments and literature. He published his own resume, the Res Gestae, part accomplishment list, part propaganda piece. Some claims were exaggerated, others outright lies, but the central message rang true. He had given Rome stability after a century of chaos. Modern historians debate Augustus's methods and morality, but Romans themselves rendered the only verdict that mattered. By the time he died, virtually no one remembered life under the old republic. They had traded political freedom for peace, prosperity, and spectacular public works, a bargain most considered worthwhile. Through masterful political maneuvering, military strategy, and cultural manipulation, this teenager who inherited a civil war had become the architect of history's longest-lasting empire. Augustus proved that sometimes the most effective revolutions happen not through dramatic declarations, but through quietly reshaping reality until the old world becomes unimaginable. The age of emperors had begun, and Rome would never be the same. Picture this. One man controls the entire Mediterranean world, ruling over territories that stretch from Spain to Africa the long way around. This revolutionary system of governance would dominate half the globe for the next 500 years. Here's the fascinating paradox of imperial Rome. By the time Augustus died, the great machine of conquest had already achieved total victory. The Republic's endless wars were over. Rome owned everything worth owning, from Iberia's silver mines to Africa's golden wheat fields. Future emperors would nibble at a few more territories, but this new era wasn't built on conquest. It was built on the victorious silence of the Pax Romana. The poets and artists of Augustus's time had finally stepped out of Greece's cultural shadow, creating a distinctly Roman identity that would set the standard for centuries. With all the heavy lifting done by previous generations, Imperial Rome faced an almost unprecedented challenge. What do you do when you've already won everything? The answer: build the most magnificently excessive civilization the world had ever seen. This surprisingly peaceful period gives us a perfect window into the structure and mind-boggling scale of the Roman world. Before, naturally, everything spectacularly falls apart. Trust me, we'll get to that chaos soon enough. But first, there's a small problem we need to address. What this empire lacks in grand civilizational conflicts, it more than makes up for with an absolute circus of royal lunatics. These monarchs generally possessed none of Caesar's charisma or Augustus's brilliance. Instead, they're remembered for the spectacular nonsense they managed to accomplish, with unlimited power and way too much free time. The gossip is entertaining at first, but after the fifth imperial train wreck crashes into the nearest scandal fest, the novelty wears thin pretty quickly. Here's the thing about these stories. Many come from historians and senators grinding personal axes, writing in a culture that already loved wild exaggeration. So let's treat these emperors as glorified calendar markers, and let your imagination fill in the blanks. Augustus's family tree had an alarming tendency toward premature death, which eventually landed Tiberius on the throne. He promptly holed himself up in his palace on the scenic island of Capri for what can only be described as an extended festival of debauchery. His successor, Caligula, nicknamed Little Boots, became legendary for stunts like nominating his horse for consul just to insult the Senate and dispatching entire armies to collect seashells from Gallic beaches. But he started some important trends: massive building projects, concentrating unprecedented power in his own hands, and most critically, getting stabbed to death by his own bodyguards in 41 AD. This assassination might have solved short-term problems, but it set a rather concerning precedent for future emperors. We'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss that pattern later. Right now, Augustus's reforms had created something remarkable. Roman armies served the emperor alone, not Senate factions or ambitious generals. After the chaos of the late Republic's civil wars, this setup dramatically reduced internal conflict and allowed the military to maintain hard-won peace. The Roman war machine had reached peak form, both functionally and aesthetically. 30-plus legions permanently stationed at the empire's frontiers projected power far beyond Rome's actual borders. On paper, there's quite a contrast between this smooth provincial operation and the royal palace shenanigans, but concentrating all the crazy into one person allowed the rest of the empire to function without obstruction or conflict. I doubt that was the intended plan, but it worked brilliantly. This is where the Roman world transformed from Italy's collection of provinces into an integrated Mediterranean system. Centered on the sea they called Mare Nostrum. Our sea, cheap and fast maritime transportation, allowed goods, resources, and endless food supplies to flow between port cities. North African grain, Iberian metals, Gallic wines, and Ephesian scholars could be found in every corner of the empire and far beyond. As always with Rome, commerce followed conquest. New provinces meant exciting new sources of wealth, while overland trade flowed along the robust road network originally built to move armies. This road system is genuinely one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, and that's saying something because I'm married to someone really pretty. The engineering magnificence doesn't stop with roads. Romans were construction maniacs who gave us concrete, domes, arches, mountain-to-city water highways, and literally heated floors. These people had zero chill when it came to building things. There's an important distinction here between quiet, private artistry and massive public works. Romans never built anything purely for beauty. They built for glory. The true Roman artists were engineers who created not just temples and theaters, but roads, bridges, aqueducts, and bath complexes. It's practical, functional artistry where beauty lies in accomplishment and usefulness to the empire. The fact that these structures are also breathtakingly gorgeous, that's just the flourish, a really big one. Let's examine the single greatest monument to Roman excess, the Colosseum. This neighborhood burned down in 64 AD, quickly replaced by a palace for the spectacularly unhinged Emperor Nero, then replaced again by new Emperor Vespasian, victor of a brief but vicious four-way civil war after Nero's death. Vespasian's legitimacy strategy was essentially bribing the Roman people with a grand public project and promising spectacular games once the arena was finished. This Herculean accomplishment relied not just on Rome's wealth, talent, and technologies like concrete, but on an imperial system specifically designed to make such projects possible. State-owned quarries and brickyards produced standardized building materials for whatever the emperor needed. Slavery was equally vital to Rome's growth and success. Every stage of buildings like the Colosseum relied partly on slave labor. First in mines, quarries, and brickyards, then working alongside freedmen and day laborers to actually construct these megaworks, and once finished, slaves fought in the arena for tens of thousands of spectators. Roughly a quarter of the empire's population was enslaved and treated as property. From fields to cities, slavery permeated every aspect of Roman society. The potential moral contradiction between Rome's achievements and its cruel methods was of disturbingly minimal concern to Roman people. The Colosseum itself shows how casually Romans attended a magnificent theater solely to watch people get absolutely destroyed. Gladiatorial matches were just the most notorious entertainment. There were also beast hunts, chariot races, and when they felt ambitious, entire naval battles, all themed and choreographed to represent famous historical and mythological stories. Even while celebrating peace, Romans loved violent spectacle. Zooming northwest to Britannia, Emperor Claudius's initial island invasion was later consolidated by Agricola, the governor who conquered Wales and northern England during Vespasian's reign. Britannia was one of few provinces added during the imperial era, and while its capital Londinium wasn't a major world metropolis, it demonstrates how quickly Rome could establish fully functioning cities seemingly from nothing. While the city of Rome looks like an urban planner's fever dream, their later additions are so well planned, it's genuinely insulting to the rest of us. Look at those beautiful grids. Roman Britain is surprisingly well documented because Agricola's son-in-law was the historian Tacitus. His Britannia account reveals how Romans viewed conquered peoples, not with particular warmth, but very committed to keeping things running smoothly. A common strategy involved designating client kingdoms to preserve local order within Rome's broader authority umbrella. This could stand alone, serve as a first step before direct Roman administration, or pacify frontiers with diplomatic finesse rather than throwing legions at problems. Most cultural exchange between Romans and new subjects involved barbaric parties adopting Roman customs to become more civilized. But the empire's cultural diversity produced wide variation in what being Roman actually meant, as Rome was influenced by local languages, art, dress, and most crucially, religion. Having essentially copy-pasted their entire pantheon from others, Rome had no trouble seeing crossover opportunities between cultures, performing fusion dances with similar deities. This approach absolutely did not apply to Judaism. Judaism was pointedly non-polytheistic, and it didn't help that Rome and Judea maintained a frequently hostile relationship. After Pompey's bloody conquest, A series of oppressive governors tightened control until revolt erupted in 66 AD. Vespasian delegated this war to his son and future emperor Titus. Jerusalem was ultimately sacked and looted. The commemorative Arch of Titus shows legionaries carting off a giant menorah, and Jews entered diaspora after their second temple's destruction. There are echoes of this treatment in Rome's approach to Christianity, another monotheistic religion considered subversive to imperial authority. But during these first 2 centuries, Christian persecution remained sporadic and localized. Whether through karma for Jerusalem or simple bad luck, Titus faced twin crises during his brief 2-year reign. Beyond another Roman fire, he had to clean up after Mount Vesuvius obliterated the entire Bay of Naples. After his death, his brother became emperor, continuing some trends and resuming others. More massive building projects after the fire, more power stripped from the Senate and more getting assassinated. This time the Praetorian Guard pressured new Emperor Nerva to adopt General Trajan as his heir. Despite all the corruption leading to this point, this is where things start getting genuinely spectacular. Trajan was a military master who pushed Roman territory to its absolute limits, building a triumphal column commemorating his magnificent Dacian conquest. Spoils from this newly subjugated province funded even more public works, including Rome's final and grandest forum, complete with 2 libraries. Here's a pleasant recurring theme this century. Anyone can spend money on personal palaces, but only true leaders give back to their people. Trajan's Mesopotamian conquest was impressively flashy, but completely unsustainable. His successor Hadrian had zero interest in further expansion, instead focusing on fortifying Britannia and Germania, while splashing money on monuments across the empire. Rome hadn't completely abandoned hope of crushing enemies. Even philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius spent 14 grueling years reluctantly fighting increasingly troublesome Germans. But practical reality was setting in. All the rich or easily conquered territories were already taken. The strategy of conquering everything that looked at you sideways was no longer viable. This is where Rome peaked. That's hardly terrible. These last 3 good emperors presided over Rome at the absolute height of its power and prosperity. There's plenty to respect in several decades of pleasantly quiet history, characterized by wise rulers and a stable empire. But remember, we're talking about Rome here. It won't be long before the Romans' legendary discipline starts to crack and things go very, very wrong. The great SPQR always maintained potential for remarkably steep falls. For now, though, there wasn't a better time to inhabit beautiful cities, enjoy brilliant engineering, prosper from expansive trade, and live in secure society. It wasn't always perfect, but this was Roman civilization at its absolute best, and sometimes doing our best is all anyone should ask. When examining Rome's history, it's inevitable to encounter several points where everything seems to go catastrophically wrong. War here, plague there, civil conflict over there. The crisis of the 3rd century picture. This, an empire so vast it spans 3 continents, suddenly tearing itself apart from within. Rome, the eternal city, watching helplessly as 50 years of pure chaos unfold. What you're about to discover is how the greatest civilization in history faced its darkest hour and somehow turned catastrophe into genius. The year is 200 AD and Rome's Golden Age is crumbling. Not from external enemies, but from something far more dangerous, its own success. Emperor after emperor falls to assassination, each more incompetent than the last. Commodus, the gladiator-obsessed tyrant, sets the tone for decades of madness to come. But here's where it gets truly insane. Emperor Alexander Severus thinks he can solve everything by throwing money at his armies. He inflates their pay to astronomical levels, funding it by debasing the currency, mixing precious metals with worthless ones. The result? Economic collapse and an army that now holds all the power. Suddenly, emperors aren't chosen by birthright or skill. They're picked by whoever commands the most swords. In just 50 years, over 20 different barracks emperors seize the throne, each lasting mere months before the next ambitious general decides it's his turn. The purple robes of imperial power become a death sentence. While Rome bleeds internally, every frontier erupts simultaneously. The Rhine frontier collapses as Franks pour through. The Danube buckles under Gothic pressure. Germanic tribes don't just raid anymore. They sail down the Atlantic coast, striking as far as Athens itself. Rome's legendary legions, spread impossibly thin, can't defend everywhere at once. Then comes the Eastern nightmare. The new Sassanid Persian Empire makes the old Parthians look like amateurs. King Shapur doesn't just defeat Roman armies, he captures Emperor Valerian alive and uses him as a human footstool. Imagine the humiliation, the master of the known world, reduced to furniture. The empire is hemorrhaging from every wound. Plague sweeps through cities, killing thousands daily. Alexandria, once a jewel of civilization, loses half its population. Trade routes collapse. Pirates roam freely within Roman waters. Cities frantically build walls, not against foreign invaders, but against their own empire's chaos. By 260 AD, something unprecedented happens. The empire doesn't just fracture, it splinters into three separate states. In the west, General Postumus creates the Gallic Empire spanning from Britain to Spain. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carves out her own kingdom, eventually declaring her son the new Caesar Augustus. Here's the shocking part. These breakaway empires actually work better than Rome itself. They're smaller, more manageable, more stable. Citizens prefer being ruled by someone one province away, rather than a distant emperor who will probably be dead within months. Rome has become too big for one person to rule effectively. Enter Aurelian, the emperor who refuses to accept defeat. In just 5 years, he accomplishes the impossible. He crushes rebellions, defeats barbarian invasions, reconquers the eastern territories, and reintegrates the western provinces. Rome calls him restorer of the world, and he's earned every letter of that title. But Rome's greatest lesson comes from Diocletian, who sees what others miss. The breakaway empires weren't problems, they were solutions. He formalizes what Postumus and Zenobia discovered by accident: divide the empire to save it. His tetrarchy creates 4 co-rulers, each managing their region with focused attention. This is Rome's true genius, not conquest but adaptation. When facing total annihilation, they don't just survive, they evolve. They take the very forces destroying them and transform those forces into tools of renewal. The crisis of the 3rd century becomes the blueprint for Roman survival for centuries to come. What emerges isn't the old Rome of unlimited expansion, but something more resilient, a civilization that learns from its own near-death experience. And this transformation sets the stage for Rome's next great chapter, where the lessons of chaos become the foundations of a new imperial age. The fall of Rome, picture this: the mightiest empire in human history, spanning 3 continents, ruling over 50 million people, suddenly gone. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. Nobody can agree on when Rome actually fell, or even if it truly did. Some historians point fingers at barbarian hordes storming the gates in 455, others blame Constantine's conversion to Christianity in 312. A few bold scholars even claim Rome didn't fall until the Ottomans brought cannons to Constantinople in 1453. It's like the ultimate historical mystery, where every detective has a different culprit. Instead of chasing impossible answers, let's dive into the real story. A centuries-long transformation that makes Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. Marcus Aurelius, Rome's philosopher-emperor, had barely been laid to rest when everything went sideways. The legendary Pax Romana, 2 centuries of peace and prosperity, shattered like glass. Rome looked finished, a crumbling giant waiting for the final blow. Then emerged a savior named Diocletian, who basically performed emergency surgery on a dying empire. For 21 years, this political genius stitched Rome back together with revolutionary reforms. The empire stabilized, threats diminished, and confidence returned. Diocletian then did something unprecedented. He voluntarily stepped down from absolute power, retiring to his seaside palace like the legendary hero Cincinnatus, who saved Rome, then returned to his farm. This wasn't just retirement, it was a declaration of victory. The empire was saved, Roman values had endured, and order was restored. But Diocletian made one fatal miscalculation. The moment he left, His carefully chosen successors immediately started butchering each other in brutal civil wars. Classic Rome, right? When Romans can't find external enemies, they become their own worst nightmare. Enter Constantine, a Western general with ambition burning in his veins. While conquering rival emperors across Italy and North Africa, something extraordinary happened. An angel appeared in a vision, commanding him to paint Christ's symbol on his soldiers' shields. When you're fighting for an empire, you don't argue with divine messengers. The Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 changed everything. Constantine's Christian army crushed their opponents, and whether he fully converted or not, he was convinced enough to legalize Christianity throughout the empire in 313 with the Edict of Milan. Centuries of persecution ended overnight. Here's where it gets brilliant. Constantine didn't just tolerate Christianity, he marketed it as patriotic. He connected Christian faith to Pax Deorum, the ancient concept that Rome receives divine blessing for righteousness and piety. Suddenly, Christianity wasn't subversive anymore, it was pro-Roman. But Constantine wasn't finished. After eliminating his last rival in 324, he founded a second capital in the east, Nova Roma, soon renamed Constantinople. This wasn't just expansion, it was insurance. Constantine succeeded where Diocletian struggled, implementing lasting economic reforms. However, he made one decision that would haunt Rome for generations, increasing reliance on foreign mercenaries. These weren't Roman soldiers fighting for Roman glory. They were hired guns with shifting loyalties. Throughout the 300s, Rome hung on by its fingernails. Power bounced between Rome and Constantinople, sometimes united under one emperor, sometimes divided. One ruler even tried re-banning Christianity. That ended predictably badly. Despite the chaos, Rome endured, though uneasily. Then came the storm that changed everything. The term barbarian originally just meant non-Roman, and for centuries these peoples had been Rome's allies, defending imperial borders alongside Roman legions. But something shifted in the northeast. The Huns, aggressive nomadic warriors, began expanding westward, creating a domino effect of displacement. When Huns invaded Gothic territories, the Ostrogoths and Visigoths had nowhere to go except into Roman lands. This wasn't invasion in the traditional sense, it was desperate migration, often negotiated through treaties. Roman emperors frequently arranged these relocations, just as they had during previous crises. The so-called barbarian invasions were actually managed refugee crises, which explains why the process was gradual, and why these peoples became increasingly integrated into Roman military and political structures as federated allies. Even when these groups started carving out kingdoms within Roman provinces, they did so through official treaties under Roman authority, remarkably similar to arrangements made during earlier crises. But having armed barbarian allies throughout your empire creates complications. Some Eastern Goths, fleeing Hun aggression, requested permission from Constantinople to cross the Danube into the Balkans for farmland. Permission granted. Other Gothic groups were denied but crossed anyway. When Roman provincial governors treated all Goths harshly regardless of legal status, they united in revolt. At Adrianople in 378, these Gothic rebels annihilated an entire Eastern Roman army. Yet after more fighting and negotiations, the result was simply more federati. Rome had no choice. The military balance had shifted. Instead of Roman generals controlling Roman legions like in the late Republic, barbarian kings now commanded the armies Rome depended on. And what do armies do when they want something from the state? They march on the capital. In 410, the Visigoths made their demands for better land and treatment by rolling up to Rome itself and sacking the ancient city. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was devastating. The Eternal City was no longer untouchable. Meanwhile, across the Western territories, massive populations of Goths, Franks, and Vandals poured across the Rhine and Danube, transforming Roman provinces into independent kingdoms. But the most terrifying threat came from the Huns themselves. In 452, Attila the Hun arrived at Rome's doorstep with his entire army. Pope Leo the Hun rode out alone to meet this destroyer of nations. Through words, divine intervention, or simply well-timed bribery, Leo convinced Attila to spare Rome. Attila withdrew, got married, and immediately died. Talk about timing. Rome's relief was short-lived. In 455, the Vandals arrived for their turn at sacking the Eternal City. Pope Leo tried his diplomatic magic again, but only managed to negotiate that the Vandals wouldn't kill civilians or destroy buildings. They could still plunder everything and everyone they wanted. Still pretty catastrophic. While the Western Empire crumbled under barbarian pressure, what about the East? Emperor Theodosius had accelerated two trends Constantine started. First, he made Nicene Christianity Rome's official religion. This sounds extreme, but it was actually one step in a centuries-long process of Christianization, spreading from urban centers to rural areas over generations. His second major decision was dividing the empire permanently between his two sons. Previous divisions had been temporary, but this split would prove permanent. Unfortunately, timing couldn't have been worse, just as the West faced its greatest challenges. This division highlighted critical weaknesses that would prove fatal. The Western Empire was poorer, less urbanized, had longer borders to defend, and was almost completely dependent on barbarian federati for military defense. When stretched legions had to prioritize defending Italy, Britain and Gaul quickly fell away, followed by Spain and North Africa, creating a death spiral that would terrify even the great restorer Aurelian. In less than a century, the Roman Empire had contracted from spanning the Mediterranean to barely controlling Italy. How do you come back from that? You don't. In 476, barbarian King Odoacer conquered Italy and deposed 16-year-old Emperor Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer sent word to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno that he had assumed control of the Western Empire on your behalf. Constantinople basically responded, "We didn't ask you to do that, but thanks." Odoacer replied, "You're welcome." And just like that, the Western Roman Empire transformed into a patchwork of Frankish and Gothic kingdoms. Italy was ruled by non-Romans for the first time in 700 years, but the Roman Empire had already been effectively dead for 2 centuries. Romans across the Mediterranean had been learning to maintain Roman culture without a Roman state. That culture had already transformed as Rome shifted from pagan to Christian. Meanwhile, the barbarian foederati had thoroughly blurred the lines between Roman and non-Roman. Often preserving Roman institutions in their new kingdoms, Gothic kings of Italy actually strengthened the Roman Senate. The Mediterranean world remained fundamentally Roman in character, until Islam arrived in the 600s. Just as Rome had created an empire long before Augustus became its first emperor, the death of the Roman Empire occurred both earlier and later than the last emperor's overthrow. Rome's greatest testament isn't its fall, but how long it survived against impossible odds. It should have been conquered by Hannibal during the Punic Wars, should have fractured during the late Republic's civil wars, and should have collapsed during the 3rd century crisis. While any civilization built on continuous conquest faces inevitable challenges when expansion stops, we must recognize that just as the Republic had become obsolete, the unified empire was no longer viable. So Rome did what it always did. It adapted. While the empire died, Rome lived on through the Byzantine Empire in the east, the Christian Church and Pope in Rome, the Romance languages, and intangible legacies like literature. Any society can see themselves in Rome's fall. But here's the philosophical truth. The fall wasn't a sad ending to a pristine civilization. It was a constant process that began the moment Romulus named his city. Their frequent failures remained inseparable from their great successes as they overcame endless crises by learning from weakness, thinking practically, and adapting from kingdom to republic to empire to papacy. The fall was always there, but so was Rome. And when the Western Empire finally collapsed in 476, the average citizen could be forgiven for barely noticing the difference. Rome after empire. Picture this. The most powerful empire in human history crumbles, yet its heart refuses to stop beating. When the last Western Roman emperor was quietly removed from power in 476 AD, most citizens barely noticed. The transition was surprisingly smooth. Compared to the brutal Vandal sacking 21 years earlier, Odoacer's arrival felt almost peaceful, but they had only known Christian Rome. never the days when their city commanded the world's greatest empire. The famous fall of 476 was merely the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for generations. The next 500 years would witness this broken city reinvent itself completely, evolving from imperial capital to the spiritual center of medieval Europe. To understand how ancient Rome became medieval Italy, we must examine the waves of new peoples making themselves at home. These were the latest in a series of allied groups who had resettled throughout the empire over the past century. They even cooperated with existing aristocrats, certainly preferable to another devastating sack. Theodoric defeated Odoacer in battle, then eliminated him during what should have been a peaceful truce dinner. For the next 3 decades, Theodoric ruled Italy and Illyria as the Byzantine Emperor's representative, proving more Roman than most late emperors. And imperial monuments, rebuilt infrastructure, and even empowered the Senate with coins declaring by the decree of the Senate. Through clever diplomacy, Theodoric gained control over the Visigothic kingdom in Spain and used marriage alliances to turn the Burgundian and Vandal kingdoms into vassal states. Italy had become a unified kingdom again, though it lacked the centralized trade networks and power structures that had made the empire flourish. Still, it fared better than most Western provinces after the collapse. The motivation and resources for grand public projects had vanished, and late antiquity's population decline reduced Rome's residents to 1/10 of its peak as people fled to the countryside. Life persevered despite the empire's absence until 535, when everything changed. Theodoric's daughter, Queen Amalasuintha, was murdered by Gothic usurpers just as the Byzantine Empire launched its reconquest of Italy under Emperor Justinian's orders. In the chaotic war between the new Gothic kings and invading Byzantines, neither side truly won, but Rome undeniably lost. Byzantine General Belisarius recaptured Naples through an ingenious aqueduct infiltration and retook Rome itself without resistance. Recovering the ancient capital for Constantinople seemed impressive, but proved short-lived. The newest Gothic king arrived to besiege the city the following year. During his absence, plague struck, and the peninsula reverted to Gothic control under yet another king who looted everything remaining in Rome that was permanently fixed in place. This king actually planned to burn the entire city and convert it into grazing land. Only Belisarius's eloquent plea stopped him, arguing that Rome stood as humanity's greatest monument to achievement across generations. Noble words, though perhaps generous given the city's condition in the mid-500s. Tens of thousands inhabited a city built for 1 million. Aqueducts ran dry, temples and palaces were stripped bare, residents occupied ancient ruins, and centuries without maintenance became apparent when buildings collapsed from earthquakes, floods, or strong winds. Frequent Tiber floods buried the city in layers of silt, covering old ruins and transforming piles of scavenged rubble into grass-covered hills. Rome's destruction wasn't solely the work of invading armies, but systematic decay, slow, relentless deterioration over centuries that even well-intentioned rulers couldn't prevent. Then came the darkest moment. In 546, the Goths forcibly evacuated the city. Rome stood utterly, completely empty. The hollow city changed hands between Goths and Byzantines 3 more times before the Byzantines finally secured it in 552 and helped resettle some Italians. Yet with the Germanic Lombards' swift invasion, Italy's troubles continued throughout the 500s. But consider this truth: Rome cannot die. It is too significant and too stubborn for something as trivial as death to claim it permanently. Just as steadily as it had first been constructed, so too could it be rebuilt. And that reconstruction began with the Church. Christianity had been the established norm for centuries, but here as a frontier province of the Byzantine Empire, the papacy gained freedom to evolve from purely religious authority over European Christianity into something approaching monarchy over its corner of Byzantine Italy. With the regional governor ruling from distant Ravenna, Rome paid nominal respect to the emperor. Through the 500s and 600s, as the popes became increasingly confident and capable leaders. They leveraged their position as Italy's largest landowner to become the province's effective governors. This transformation occurred gradually, then suddenly. The Byzantines embroiled themselves in religious artwork controversies during the 720s. Then the Lombards conquered Ravenna. This special Frankish relationship flourished under Pepin's son Charlemagne, who confirmed papal authority in central Italy and was later crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in 800 AD. What a busy century indeed. By 800, Rome had expanded its religious influence across Europe, assumed direct control over the Papal States, and gained an entire empire as ally. This arrangement would remain, despite growing pains in coming centuries, the foundation of European politics for the next 1,000 years. Charlemagne's rise also established Latin's medieval role. Rome's language had always contained regional variations, and spoken Latin rarely matched formal oratory or literature. Without an empire enforcing linguistic consistency, colloquial Latin began evolving into Romance languages earlier than expected. Latin speakers across Europe were softening consonants and merging vowel sounds even before the Western Empire's fall. It remained Latin, but had diverged from classical models already resembling Italian, French, and Spanish. Since this Church Latin sounded so different from everyday speech, Europeans began writing their vernacular languages phonetically to distinguish them from Latin. Here, Latin fossilized into uniform standard, while allowing early vernaculars to freely develop into Romance languages. This began in the 300s and 400s, with Rome's first purpose-built churches, St. John Lateran, Santa Maria Maggiore, and Old St. Peter's. These classical-styled buildings abandoned cramped pagan temple layouts to emulate the spacious basilica structure used in law courts, soon becoming the standard European church design. Basilicas continued appearing through the Western Empire's fall, but the following centuries saw little construction due to Gothic wars and their concentrated damage, the worst Rome had ever suffered. However, this constraint created opportunity. In 609 AD, the Pope established a new church by reconsecrating the ancient Roman pantheon as St. Mary of the Martyrs. Old buildings could be converted into housing, marble cladding could be stripped and reused in churches, bronze statues could be melted for new metal, and marble statues could be broken down into lime for mortar. Painfully unsentimental, but extremely practical. Some structures, like the Aurelian walls, remained perfectly functional, encouraging some 50,000 Italians to return to Rome after the Lombard conquests. True to Belisarius's words, when Muslim conquests closed the Holy Land to Christian pilgrimage, Rome became the premier destination for Christian pilgrims, and that meant profitable business. The old hilltop core had become largely uninhabited, while population clustered around the Campus Martius near the Pantheon. Despite its reduced size, Rome remained Christian Europe's largest city after Constantinople. Pilgrimage proved such profitable business that even dead visitors generated income. The church confiscated possessions of pilgrims who died in the city. About a dozen major noble families built personal fortresses in the city's ruins, far fewer than the thousands of aristocrats in the classical period. Justinian attempted to save it by lowering property qualifications for membership, but its power, prestige, and membership steadily eroded over decades until, on some unknown day, it ended. In the 570s, it still sent embassies to the east and greeted the emperor during his 603 visit. More striking than deposing the child emperor in 476, the most fundamental and persistent Roman institution died with so little ceremony we don't even know when. Yet the ancient aristocratic tradition of causing governmental trouble thrived, as powerful families competed for papal influence during the 10th. Finally, Rome's earlier political break with Constantinople was cemented by religious schism, dividing the Pope's Catholic Church from the Eastern Orthodox Church. 3 decades later, Rome was sacked by the Normans in 1084. After all these centuries, northern peoples returned to sack Rome, history's patterns reasserting themselves. What have we witnessed unfold? Ancient ruins served new purposes. Religious diplomacy created an entire empire. Latin simultaneously gained new life. Even Belisarius couldn't have realized how prophetic his words were about Rome's meaning and endless significance. These 5 transformative centuries established its identity not merely as an ancient capital, but as the eternal city, a title that would echo through the ages as this remarkable city continued to reinvent itself again and again. The empire that refused to die, Byzantium's secret survival picture. This, while medieval Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages, one empire was quietly thriving for another 1,000 years, calling itself Rome, long after Rome itself had fallen. This is the story of history's greatest plot twist, the empire that death forgot. When the Western Roman Empire crumbled, everyone assumed the Roman story was over. But they were dead wrong. The eastern half didn't just survive, it evolved, adapted, and became something magnificent. The question isn't just how they lasted so long, but how they managed to stay fundamentally Roman while transforming into something entirely new. Our tale kicks off in the early 300s with an empire so fractured it had been split into 4 pieces just to function. Naturally, these pieces immediately started fighting each other because, well, Roman's gonna Roman. But then Constantine swept in, reunited everything, and made a decision that would echo through centuries. He looked at the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, perfectly positioned where Europe meets Asia, controlling the gateway between the Black Sea and Mediterranean, and declared it the perfect spot for a new capital. 6 years of frantic construction later, he unveiled New Rome in 330 AD, though the folks back in original Rome weren't exactly thrilled about the competition. But founding a new capital was just the beginning. Constantine had also embraced Christianity, creating a fascinating challenge. How do you control a religion that's inherently disruptive to traditional power structures? His solution was brilliant. Instead of trying to crush Christian fervor, he channeled it. When Christians in Alexandria started rioting over theological debates, Constantine didn't send in the lions. Instead, he convened the Council of Nicaea, bringing bishops together to hammer out official church doctrine. This wasn't just about religion, it was political genius. By creating official Christian orthodoxy, he transformed a potentially rebellious force into a pillar of imperial authority. These 2 moves, the new Eastern capital and the Christianization of imperial power, set the stage for everything that followed. The East was already diverging from the old empire, but the real acceleration came in the chaotic century that followed. After Constantine's sons predictably turned on each other in civil war, the empire got Julian, history's most reluctant emperor. This tragic introvert spent 2 years desperately trying to drag the empire back to paganism before getting himself killed on a poorly planned Persian campaign. Then came a parade of forgettable emperors who seemed determined to solve exactly none of Rome's mounting problems. Enter Theodosius with his wild idea. What if we just permanently split the empire in half? Previous divisions had always reunited eventually, but Theodosius made this one stick. In 395 AD, the Byzantine Empire officially began its independent existence, though calling it Byzantine is actually anachronistic. To its people, this was still Rome, pure and simple. This split proved disastrous for the West, but brilliant for the East. While Western emperors fumbled their way toward collapse, the Byzantines played a masterful game of survival. When Gothic tribes threatened, they simply bribed them to go bother Italy instead. Classy, not really. Effective, absolutely. Meanwhile, Constantinople was busy becoming impregnable. The massive Theodosian walls, 3 tiers of fortifications that would protect the city for the next millennium, began rising at the turn of the 5th century. But even the strongest walls couldn't protect the empire from its strangest threat: sports riots. Romans took their chariot racing seriously, aligning with either the blues or the greens. What started as team loyalty evolved into full-blown political factions that fought in churches and turned sporting events into potential government overthrows. These weren't just rowdy fans, they were organized political movements using the races as platforms for dissent. The worst explosion came under Justinian, a man whose rise from humble origins to supreme power reads like ancient fiction. Along with his uncle Justin, he engineered one of history's rare reverse regencies, with the younger man pulling strings behind the throne. During this time, he fell for Theodora, a former actress who would become his partner in both love and power. But when Justinian tried to curb the blues and greens' political influence, he managed the impossible, uniting them in rebellion. For 5 straight days, they torched Constantinople while chanting "Victory!" the infamous Nika riots that nearly ended his reign before it truly began. As flames consumed his capital, Justinian prepared to flee, but Theodora delivered one of history's most powerful speeches, declaring she'd rather die as an empress than live as an exile. Her words about royal purple being the noblest shroud became legendary, and they steeled Justinian's resolve to fight back. The riots ended in a bloodbath at the stadium, but from those ashes rose something spectacular. Justinian rebuilt Constantinople grander than ever, crowned by his masterpiece, the Hagia Sophia. This wasn't just a church, it was an architectural revolution. The massive dome, ringed with windows that cast ethereal light on golden mosaics, seemed to float in defiance of gravity itself. When Justinian first entered the completed church, he reportedly exclaimed that he had surpassed Solomon. We can still witness this architectural miracle today, its influence echoing through centuries of design across the Mediterranean and beyond. But Justinian wasn't content with just building. He codified centuries of Roman law into a single comprehensive legal system, the Corpus Juris Civilis, that still forms the foundation of European law today. One law, one church, one empire. That was his vision. The empire part proved tricky since Rome had been missing from the Roman Empire for over 50 years. Never mind that the Italian Gothic kings were actually doing a better job than the last Western emperors, or that Italians still considered themselves Romans living in Roman institutions. Justinian wanted his map painted purple, so he unleashed Belisarius on the west. And what a unleashing it was. Belisarius conquered Carthage and North Africa from the Vandals in under a year with minimal casualties. For this spectacular victory, Justinian awarded him a triumph, an honor reserved exclusively for emperors since Augustus. With this foothold secured, Belisarius launched his Italian campaign. The reconquest of Italy proved more challenging, but Belisarius was nothing if not creative. He stormed Naples through its aqueducts and marched triumphantly into Rome itself. Because marching on Rome, as he might have said, is a right reserved only for Roman generals. The Ostrogoths fought back fiercely, besieging Rome for nearly a year, but Belisarius held firm and pushed north to Milan and the political capital of Ravenna. But success in the west came with a price. The east lay dangerously exposed. Persian King Khosrau wasn't about to miss this opportunity. He even joked with Justinian that he deserved credit for the western victories since he'd been polite enough not to invade while Byzantium was distracted. Justinian good-naturedly paid him a share of the spoils for his help. Of course, 6 years later, Khosrau did invade, sacked Antioch, and built a replacement city he literally named Khosrau's Better Antioch. This perfectly captures the peculiar relationship between these ancient superpowers, deeply familiar rivals who couldn't help but respect each other even while fighting. As Khosrau the Tone put it, Rome and Persia were the two eyes of the world, chosen by divine will to illuminate human civilization. They might fight, business was business, but they were professionals about it. Still, business meant Khosrau proceeded to invade Mesopotamia in 540, splitting Justinian's attention between distant fronts while Ostrogothic resistance continued in Italy. Then the Black Death arrived, ravaging both empires and nearly finishing what warfare had started. The empire would have collapsed if not for Theodora's Herculean efforts, keeping everything together while Justinian lay in a plague-induced coma. Amid this chaos, the Ostrogoths actually sacked and destroyed Rome, leaving the Eternal City a ghost town and forcing Belisarius to reconquer Italy all over again. One bright spot emerged from this devastation. The city of Ravenna became home to some of the most spectacular Byzantine art and architecture ever created. Even by the 500s, Byzantine artists had perfected their golden aesthetic and mosaic techniques to near perfection. Over 4 decades, Justinian survived attempted overthrow, rebuilt his capital, codified law, standardized church hierarchy, weathered plague, and reconquered much of the West. His reign represented a massive evolutionary leap for the Byzantine Empire, and ironically proved that the empire no longer needed Rome to be Roman. Good thing too, because 3 years after Justinian died, the Lombards swept across the Alps and seized 2/3 of Italy. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, things were heading from A to Oof pretty quickly. Emperor Maurice got deposed by his own army in favor of the utterly incompetent Phocas. Persian King Khosrau II, who had genuinely liked Maurice and owed him for help in an earlier civil war, vowed revenge. He declared war and pushed deep into Anatolia before turning south to capture the Levant and Egypt. This looked like game over until Heraclius, son of North Africa's governor, arrived like a classical hero. He booted Phocas from power and revolutionized imperial governance by combining civil and military authority. This flexibility proved crucial because, unlike earlier Roman armies that could always raise more legions, Heraclius had to make do with what he had. After a grueling campaign that nearly bankrupted the empire, Heraclius pushed into Persia's heartland and negotiated peace. Both empires reverted to pre-war borders, standing battered but breathing. Unfortunately, they'd exhausted themselves just as a new power emerged from Arabia. The Rashidun Caliphate exploded outward with devastating speed, conquering the entire Levant in 8 years and adding Egypt and Persia within another decade. Constantinople itself faced Arab siege, but held thanks to their secret weapon, essentially ancient napalm. This shattered the millennium-old balance between Rome and Persia so completely that Byzantines actually sent aid to their traditional Persian enemies against the Caliphate. By century's end, Byzantium found itself permanently excluded from the southern Mediterranean. The northern front wasn't much better. Slavic forces had pushed into the Peloponnese, splitting Greece and leaving the empire looking like a strategic checkerboard. These are the so-called Dark Ages, though ouch times might be more accurate. Yet with over 7 centuries still ahead, the empire's greatest achievements lay in the future. Amid all this territorial loss, it's easy to miss the profound transformation occurring. The Empire of 300 had been pagan, bilingual in Greek and Latin, and Mediterranean spanning. Now it maintained Roman law and governmental structure while becoming distinctly Christian and Greek. Geographically, it resembled the classical Greek world more than the old Roman Empire. Greek became the primary language, and its greatest legacy became preserving ancient scholarship. 2/3 of all surviving ancient Greek texts came to us through Byzantine preservation. Constantinople's library, not Alexandria's, performed the real heavy lifting for posterity. This Greek identity led some historians to dismiss Byzantium as somehow inauthentic, but they missed the point. The Byzantines maintained that fundamentally Roman capacity to adapt and evolve for survival. Their golden age, literally golden considering their incredible mosaics, was just beginning to dawn. Picture an empire that perfected the art of surviving catastrophe while creating masterpieces. The Byzantines mastered this impossible balancing act, turning disaster management into their signature brand for over 1,000 years. Most empires crumble under pressure, but Byzantium thrived on it. They transformed crisis into opportunity, creating brilliant innovations during their darkest hours, while somehow stumbling through spectacular failures during their golden periods. Like their Roman ancestors, they possessed an almost supernatural ability to keep going when any reasonable civilization would have surrendered. Their southern territories had vanished overnight, swallowed by the expanding Muslim caliphate. Twice, enemy forces had reached Constantinople's gates, only to meet the empire's most terrifying weapon. Greek fire erupted from bronze siphons, turning enemy fleets into floating infernos that burned even on water's surface. This mysterious incendiary became their salvation, a closely guarded secret that made their enemies fear the very seas around the capital. Constantinople stood as the world's most impregnable fortress. The legendary Theodosian walls had never fallen, while beneath the city lay hundreds of vast cisterns, ensuring water supplies during any siege. No other metropolis could match its defenses, though the same couldn't be said for the distant provinces, where Muslim armies carved through Anatolia like a hot knife through butter. Emperor Leo III finally stabilized the eastern frontier in 740, while his son Constantine V secured the western borders by pushing back Slavic incursions. After 150 years of relentless warfare, the empire had found its footing again. But their recovery came with an unexpected price that would forever change Byzantine culture. The great iconoclastic controversy erupted like a theological earthquake. Byzantines had always cherished religious art, filling their churches and homes with beautiful images of Christ, Mary, and the saints. But Emperor Leo saw danger in this devotion, viewing it as dangerous idolatry that threatened true faith. His solution was characteristically direct and devastating. Starting in 726, imperial forces systematically destroyed every religious image they could find. Mosaics, frescoes, statues, even simple drawings disappeared under the hammers of the iconoclasts. Constantine V escalated the campaign, persecuting clergy who supported religious imagery. Meanwhile, the Pope in Rome watched in horror as centuries of Christian art vanished, while the Byzantine province of Ravenna seized independence in protest. The destruction continued for over a century, with brief periods of restoration, followed by renewed campaigns of artistic annihilation. Finally, Empress Theodora ended the madness in 843, establishing rules that banned three-dimensional religious sculptures while permitting flat artwork. Byzantine artists emerged from this cultural trauma with a revolutionary new style, creating stylized figures set against backgrounds of pure gold that would define Eastern Orthodox art for the next millennium. While iconoclasm devastated artistic heritage, it sparked crucial military and administrative reforms that saved the empire. The old Roman system of defenseless provinces awaiting distant legions had proven fatally inadequate. Byzantine innovators replaced it with the revolutionary thema system, fundamentally restructuring both military and civilian governance. Each thema became a self-contained military district under a strategos, who commanded both civil administration and local defense forces. Instead of professional armies stationed far from their families, each thema maintained citizen soldiers who owned land within their district. Every warrior had personal stakes in their region's survival, creating fierce loyalty and effective resistance against invasion. Though the empire had shrunk to half its former size, the eastern frontier transformed from a disaster zone into an unbreachable fortress. Scholars and historians supported these military innovations by writing comprehensive tactical manuals. Works like the Strategicon provided detailed guidance on strategy and battlefield tactics, acknowledging that the empire could no longer afford the massive, decisive battles of earlier eras. With enemies on every border ready to exploit any weakness, every victory came at tremendous cost. Campaigns succeeded through careful calculation and superior intelligence rather than brute force. The empire survived by maintaining flexibility and eagerly adopting innovative ideas from their adversaries. The Byzantine military evolved beyond recognition, trading raw numbers for peak efficiency. Infantry remained essential, but the old Roman legionaries transformed into the elite scutatoi, named for their distinctive kite shields that replaced traditional Roman scuta. Toxotai archers provided ranged support, but the army's most feared unit was the mighty cataphractos. These fully armored warriors represented the ultimate fusion of man and horse, with both rider and mount protected by gleaming scale armor from head to hoof. Originally developed during the Parthian Wars, they reached perfection as counters to Arab cavalry tactics. While enemy horsemen initially ran circles around Byzantine infantry, the cataphractos eventually became the empire's signature weapon and symbol of imperial power. As a predominantly coastal empire, Byzantium maintained formidable naval forces across the Aegean, Mediterranean, and Black Sea. In history's greatest example of, if it works, don't change it, they continued using upgraded versions of the ancient trireme after 2 millennia of service. Their dromon vessels combined traditional rowing power with modern lateen sails, bristling with catapults, ballistae, and the dreaded Greek fire projectors. Rather than simply ramming enemy vessels like their ancient predecessors, dromoi carried specialized spurs designed to shatter enemy oars and immobilize ships for boarding or burning. While this impressive fleet couldn't prevent Muslim conquests of Crete, Sicily, and Sardinia, it successfully protected the mainland coasts, Aegean islands, and the crucial trade routes flowing through Constantinople's strategic position. With iconoclasm finally resolved and existential threats temporarily contained, Byzantium entered 2 centuries of unprecedented prosperity. The Macedonian dynasty, beginning with Basil I, guided the empire through its true Golden Age, reaching peaks of prestige and cultural influence that rivaled the greatest Roman achievements. Having stabilized their eastern and southern frontiers, the Byzantines turned diplomatic attention northward. Through clever religious diplomacy, they converted the Bulgarians to Christianity, transforming dangerous enemies into Orthodox allies. Prince Volodymyr of the Kievan Rus received the same treatment, establishing Eastern Europe's Cyrillic alphabet and Byzantine-influenced Orthodox Christianity. In return, Volodymyr provided the legendary Varangian Guard, elite Scandinavian mercenaries who served as imperial bodyguards for centuries. This wasn't the peaceful Pax Romana of ancient times. The Byzantines still fought on multiple fronts, and the Bulgarians even captured northern Greece during the 900s before Basil the Coup reconquered it a century later. But compared to their desperate earlier struggles, the empire was flourishing magnificently. Constantinople reached its absolute zenith by the year 1000, housing 500,000 inhabitants as the world's largest, best defended, and most magnificent metropolis. Hagia Sophia received gorgeous new decorations after the end of iconoclasm, while the city maintained its role as a living window into the classical world, with Roman-style churches, a massive chariot stadium, and marble and porphyry architecture stretching to every horizon. But Constantinople transcended its Roman heritage to become the Mediterranean's keystone city, a true cosmopolis where people from every nation could trade, work, and live together. Catholic churches served Italian quarters, while a mosque accommodated Muslim residents and diplomatic guests, demonstrating the empire's commitment to commemorating all cultures through architecture. Throughout the empire, Byzantine architects created magnificent urban cathedrals and dramatic cliffside monasteries. Ironically, the best preserved examples of peak Byzantine art survive not within the empire itself, but among its rivals and neighbors. Venice and the Normans maintained complex relationships with Constantinople, simultaneously fighting against Byzantine power while enthusiastically adopting Byzantine artistic styles. St. Mark's Basilica and the Palatine Chapel represent Italy's finest collections of Golden Age Byzantine art, while St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv remains Ukraine's proudest testament to its Orthodox Byzantine legacy. These masterpieces preserve the glory that was lost when later disasters struck the heartland. Culturally, the empire had never reached greater heights, but politically, serious cracks were appearing in the imperial foundation. While the Byzantines had successfully expanded back into the Balkans and beyond Anatolia, the empire functioned better on defense than offense, and the carefully designed Thema system began suffering from bureaucratic bloat. Regional strategoi grew complacent, abandoning civic responsibilities to play power games within their districts. Meanwhile, comfortable bureaucrats in Constantinople barely looked up from their administrative duties, hidden behind Theodosian walls and golden church domes. Each faction blamed the other for mounting problems while doing nothing to solve them. The emperor worsened matters by increasingly ignoring the themata in favor of the tagma, a standing army designed primarily for campaigning rather than territorial defense. This left Byzantium dangerously overextended and poorly prepared for new threats, like trying to fight enemies with overcooked pasta instead of sharp steel. From the west, the Normans swept into southern Italy, conquering the last Byzantine strongholds. From the east, the Seljuk Turks inflicted such devastating defeats that Anatolia simply vanished from imperial control. They didn't even need to work particularly hard for their victory. Half the Byzantine army deserted before reaching the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, while the remaining generals made catastrophic miscalculations leading to an entirely preventable disaster. The battle itself barely mattered. Afterward, the Byzantines essentially shrugged and allowed the Turks to take everything else. By 1075, the empire had never been smaller or weaker. You'd think descendants of the Greeks would understand something about hubris, but apparently not. The 11th century also shattered the already fragile relationship between Constantinople and Rome. Justinian's grand vision of one church and one empire had died when the southern Mediterranean fell to Muslim conquest and Byzantine authority in Rome remained purely ceremonial. The official split of the Papal States in 754 merely formalized existing reality. Communication between East and West suffered because few Byzantines spoke Latin, while few Italians understood Greek. Disputes like iconoclasm exacerbated fundamental disagreements about papal supremacy versus Byzantine religious independence. These incompatible positions culminated when a Roman delegate marched into Hagia Sophia during religious services and excommunicated the entire Byzantine Church. The Greeks responded with their own excommunications, creating the Great Schism that permanently separated the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. While nobody at the time fully grasped the implications, this moment marked Christianity's final division into Western and Eastern branches. But Emperor Alexios, I saw opportunity within catastrophe. After ending nearly a decade of civil war in 1081, his Komnenos dynasty oversaw a remarkable revival throughout the 12th century. He stabilized the empire for nearly 4 decades, negotiated new trade agreements with Venice, and devised a clever plan to reclaim Anatolia by requesting Pope Urban's military assistance in exchange for recognizing papal supremacy. Unfortunately, Urban's hearing proved selective. Instead of sending a reasonable force to help Byzantine reconquest, he dispatched several armies worth of European warriors determined to retake the Holy Land. This wasn't the plan at all, but now Alexios had to manage these enthusiastic crusaders and redirect them toward Jerusalem before they conquered his own territory instead. The Crusaders showed far more interest in establishing their own kingdoms than restoring Byzantine lands, while subsequent crusades only entangled the empire deeper into European political chaos, earning nothing but antagonism from Western neighbors. The Normans constantly probed into Greece, while the Venetians monopolized Byzantine trade. Despite these complications, the Komnenos dynasty left the empire significantly stronger than they found it, reclaiming coastal Anatolia, modernizing the economy under Venetian supervision, and continuing to produce magnificent gold-covered artwork. During this period, Princess Anna Komnene composed an epic poem about her father Alexios's reign, becoming history's first female historian and absolute literary legend. Her achievement perfectly embodied the Byzantine motto, definitely precarious, but hey, it could have been much worse. When this chapter began, the empire faced complete collapse with hemorrhaging provinces and systematic destruction of their artistic heritage. But it's no accident they recovered to stabilize their borders and revitalize their culture. The Byzantines survived by being clever and never surrendering. The Thema system represents genius innovation in governance, purchasing an entire golden age of prosperity and cultural achievement. When they grew careless over time, they persevered through new crises and turned things around again. Byzantine history isn't admirable despite their setbacks. It's inspiring because they perfected being a golden disaster empire. Remember, life isn't about avoiding catastrophe or never losing North Africa, Greece, or Anatolia. What matters is continuing to try regardless of circumstances, because golden ages can dawn when you least expect them. It's remarkable how the Byzantines maintained continuity across such vast spans of time. While the Western Roman Empire was crumbling into memory, the Byzantine Empire's final stand picture this. While Western Rome crumbled into dust in 476 AD, its eastern twin was just getting started on what would become history's most spectacular survival story. Constantinople stood gleaming like a golden beacon, where ancient Greek wisdom merged with Roman power and Christian faith into something entirely new. But here's the thing about being the last torchbearer of an empire. Everyone wants to snuff out your flame. From the moment the Byzantines emerged from Rome's ashes, they faced an endless parade of enemies. Persians hammered them from the east. Gothic tribes swept down from the north. Arab armies thundered across the desert, and Turkish forces pressed ever westward. Add in the Normans, plus the empire's own talent for civil wars, and you've got a recipe for disaster that should have ended this story centuries before it actually did. Yet somehow, like a phoenix that refused to stay buried, Byzantium kept rising from each catastrophe stronger than before. These weren't just survivors, they were masters of the impossible comeback. The empire's golden age of mosaics and massive domes couldn't protect them from what came next. Italian merchants had turned Constantinople into their personal chessboard, with Venetian and Genoese traders treating the city's Latin quarters like gang territories. The Byzantines made a fatal miscalculation. They arrested and executed tens of thousands of these foreign merchants in a single bloody purge. This massacre coincided perfectly with the most incompetent dynasty in Byzantine history taking power. The Angelus family turned imperial governance into a comedy of errors, with brothers fighting brothers while the empire hemorrhaged resources and respect. Then came the Fourth Crusade, supposedly launched to reclaim the Holy Land, but destined to become Christianity's greatest betrayal. When the crusading army got excommunicated before they even left Europe, young Prince Alexios Angelos saw an opportunity. He promised the desperate crusaders Byzantine gold and military support if they'd help restore his deposed father to the throne. There was just one problem. He didn't have the money he was promising. The Crusaders had learned 3 essential rules from previous Byzantine encounters. Never ask Crusaders for help, get them out of your territory as fast as possible, and never, ever provoke armed religious fanatics. The Angelus dynasty managed to break all 3 rules spectacularly. In 1204, the Crusaders simply took what they'd been promised by force, sacking Constantinople in an orgy of destruction that shocked even medieval Europe. Venice orchestrated the pillaging with cold calculation, stealing priceless relics, while their Crusader allies burned and murdered their way through the greatest city in Christendom. When the smoke cleared, the Byzantine Empire existed only on paper. The capital lay in ruins, the Aegean islands belonged to Venice, and Frankish lords carved up the Greek mainland like a holiday feast. But death certificates were premature. Byzantine nobles scattered to the winds, establishing 3 separate successor states in Trebizond, Nicaea, and Epirus. Each became a magnet for Greek refugees fleeing their new Latin overlords. The Franks quickly discovered that conquering was easier than governing. Their Latin empire became a money pit that drained resources while accomplishing nothing. Meanwhile, the supposedly defeated Byzantines were quietly rebuilding their strength. Michael Palaiologos of Nicaea emerged as the shrewdest of the Byzantine successors. He transformed his defensive army into an aggressive, mobile force capable of fighting on 4 fronts simultaneously. While his rivals played it safe, Michael gambled everything on lightning campaigns across western Anatolia and into Europe. Then fate handed him the ultimate prize through sheer accident. A small Byzantine scouting party approached Constantinople to assess its defenses, only to discover the Frankish garrison had marched out on campaign. The scouts slipped through a breach in the walls, opened the gates, and retook the greatest city in the world, almost by accident. For once, luck favored the Byzantines instead of their enemies, but retaking Constantinople was only the beginning of Michael's problems. The city had barely been maintained since the Crusader sack 50 years earlier. The empire was a hollow shell of its former glory, ruling over ruins and memories. How do you defend an empire that's broken and surrounded by enemies? The Byzantines got creative. They revolutionized their military financing through an updated version of the ancient pronoia system, essentially creating medieval military contractors. Heavy cavalry received local taxation rights instead of salaries, while infantry forces appeared whenever battles needed fighting. A patchwork system that somehow held together through desperate innovation. This military represented everything Byzantine. Heavy cavalry paid through a medieval twist on ancient Roman tax farming, supported by citizen soldiers who traced their lineage back to Greek city-states. Desperation bred ingenuity, and ingenuity kept the empire alive. Diplomacy became their sharpest weapon, though the eternal rivalry between Venice and Genoa kept turning Constantinople into a battlefield. The Byzantines made costly mistakes, like hiring Catalan mercenaries who went rogue and conquered the Duchy of Athens for themselves. But their worst mercenary experience came in 1343, when the royal treasury was so empty that former Empress Anna pawned the crown jewels to pay for Venetian warships. Despite literally selling the empire's honor for military support, she lost her civil war anyway. This particular disaster illustrated the Byzantines' talent for self-destruction. When Emperor Andronikos died, he left 9-year-old John Palaiologos as heir. The boy's mother, Anna, wanted to rule as regent, while Andronikos' second-in-command, John Cantacuzénos, demanded to serve as co-emperor until the child came of age. Their civil war split Byzantine society along class lines and spawned its own religious controversy. When John Cantacuzénos and his wife were finally crowned in 1347, the original crown jewels were sitting in Venetian pawn shops along with every other Byzantine treasure, so they wore crowns made of tinted glass. Nothing captures the empire's tragic dignity quite like emperors being crowned in fake jewelry, because they'd sold the real thing to pay for a war they lost anyway. John Palaiologos turned 20 a few years later and immediately launched another civil war to kick out his co-emperor, making the entire tragedy a complete waste of blood and treasure. Yet somehow civil war wasn't even the worst disaster of the 1340s. The Black Death arrived like the final nail in Byzantium's coffin. Population devastated, economy obliterated, defenses crumbling. The empire lay helpless before its greatest challenge yet. Far to the east, a small Turkish beylik led by Osman had been quietly building something extraordinary. While the Byzantines tore themselves apart, the Ottomans leveraged military brilliance, diplomatic cunning, and the convenient arrival of plague to reshape the entire Eastern Roman world in just 1 century. The Ottomans weren't Roman like the Byzantines were Roman, but they understood something crucial. They were entering the Roman orbit, and eventually they intended to reach its center. This wasn't a clash between alien civilizations. It was the latest chapter in Rome's endless story of absorption and transformation. A century after retaking Constantinople, 4 fundamental problems guaranteed the empire's doom. Ottoman expansion from the East, Venetian-Genoese warfare, turning the Aegean into a battleground. Complete economic dependence on these same Italian rivals, and the endless cycle of internal power struggles that defined Roman politics across 2 millennia. With challenges like these, rebuilding the empire was impossible. The Byzantines were reduced to picking their battles, biding their time, and eventually placing themselves under Ottoman protection while never abandoning hope. But while Constantinople shrank to a shadow of itself, something remarkable was happening across the Aegean Sea. When Michael Palaiologos retook Constantinople in 1261, he also captured the Latin Prince of Achaia in battle and ransomed him for a handful of mountain fortresses in the Peloponnese. These weren't much, just well-fortified positions among the peaks where ancient Spartans had once made their stand. Over 2 centuries, this distant Byzantine outpost in Laconia became a beacon of Hellenic civilization. Greeks from across the region flocked to the city of Mistras, determined to preserve what the empire had built. During the 13th and 14th centuries, Mistras emerged as a center of Byzantine culture and scholarship that rivaled anything the empire had produced in its Golden Age. This wasn't the full empire restored, but it represented something equally powerful: the unbreakable spirit of Romano-Hellenic persistence, the determination to keep building even when everything seemed lost. Geography made the Morea easier to defend than Constantinople. Water on 3 sides, mountains on the 4th. When Constantinople became too focused on Ottoman threats to govern effectively, the Morea gained autonomy in 1349. By the early 1400s, it controlled almost the entire Peloponnese and briefly held authority over Attica. The Byzantine Morea served as a training ground for future emperors, teaching them statecraft in preparation for ruling from Constantinople. The last emperor, Constantine V, was actually crowned in Mystras rather than the traditional capital. But even this remarkable achievement couldn't change what was coming. The Ottomans simply wouldn't stop. Despite the empire's diplomatic mastery and last-minute crusader reinforcements that crumbled on contact, the end was approaching. By 1453, Sultan Mehmet possessed the means to take Constantinople, specifically cannons the size of houses. After blockading the Bosphorus and cutting the city's supply lines, Ottoman artillery blasted open the legendary Theodosian walls that had protected Constantinople for over 1,000 years. As enemy soldiers poured through the breach, Emperor Constantine gave a final speech to his people before charging into the thickest fighting, never to be seen again. When the battle ended, Sultan Mehmet toured his conquest and was so moved by the beauty of Hagia Sophia that he preserved it as a mosque rather than destroying it entirely. A gesture of respect from conqueror to conquered. But even this wasn't truly the end of the Byzantine story. The Ottomans continued the empire's architectural traditions, and ethnic Romans played meaningful roles throughout Ottoman history as administrators, artists, merchants, sailors, and soldiers. Constantinople remained the Mediterranean's keystone city, more prosperous and secure than it had been in centuries. When Mehmet declared himself Caesar Caesar of Rome, he wasn't just claiming conquest, but accepting responsibility. In Rome's own terms, he was both destroyer and builder, ending one chapter while beginning another. Greek culture continued flourishing across the former Byzantine world, whether under Ottoman rule or Venetian governance. There's an ancient saying that Rome conquered Greece, but Greece conquered Rome, describing how Hellenic culture always transforms whatever state absorbs it. This remained true under the Ottomans, the Venetians, and everyone else who ruled over Greek communities. Venetian territories in the Aegean and Ionian seas were majority Greek, and these communities played an outsized role in bringing classical ideas to Renaissance Europe. Crete especially became a center of scholarship that mixed traditional Hellenism with Renaissance innovation. The ultimate irony, Venice, whose treachery had destroyed the Byzantine Empire, became crucial to preserving Byzantine culture for posterity. As we enter the 15th and 16th centuries, the days of Greeks ruling their ancient empire from Constantinople were long gone. The standard question about Byzantium is simple. Why didn't this disaster magnet empire die centuries earlier, when everything was constantly on fire? Because while the Byzantine story spans over 1,000 years of shrinking borders, that timeline would have been much shorter without their incredible persistence. They lasted over a millennium, by some measures the longest-running empire in history. They achieved this because at no point in Byzantine history was it too late to care or too late to try. They believed their state, their people, their faith, and their identity were worth dying for and worth living for. Even when the last Golden Age was a distant memory, that tireless determination to do their best kept them going through the most dire circumstances, always reaching for the next mini-Golden Age just around the corner. When we ask why the Byzantines endured after Rome fell in 476, it's the same reason they survived Constantinople's fall in 1204, because the Byzantines, the Greeks, the Romans always endured. And here we reach the end of Rome's story, from that first city by the Tiber to the fall of the last true Roman state. This wasn't the complete story. We could have explored architecture, literature, or countless other threads across 2 millennia. But this was the essential narrative of Roman civilization across more than 2,000 years. Roman statehood ends precisely at the Italian Renaissance's dawn, where classical art and scholarship would spring to the forefront of European consciousness and continue influencing Western culture to our present day. Germany would helm its own 1,000-year Roman-inspired empire, while Rome's legacy continued shaping European society long after the original state vanished. Though the old empire fell in 476 AD, by the year 1000, Rome remained Europe's cultural center in religion, language, art, architecture, literature, and politics. Similarly, in the East, Byzantine civilization endured long after Constantinople came under the Sultan's reign. Even when those states died, the ideas they championed and the people who called them home carried on regardless. Rome always adapts, and these were its final transformations.